Hello, and welcome back to the 100 Game Analysis of Guardian. This is going to be a special episode, so no game today. I'm going to be reviewing our past 10 games in sort of a manner that I haven't really been doing so far. I'm not going to go in depth into each run like I usually do uh, after each run, uh, like I do to recap exactly what happened and all the different things. This is going to be more of an overview of all the runs. See if I can see any patterns of any kind. See where we'll go from here. Uh, if you notice, if you've seen the spreadsheet before, I am on the private version of. Oops, excuse me. I'm on the private version of the spreadsheet because episode 10 is not out yet at the time of me recording this. So I have everything updated on the spreadsheet, but not the public one. So yeah. So we've got 10 runs so far. Uh, we've only had one loss, which is interesting. Uh, Honestly, I feel like I've been kind of lucky in these first 10. Uh, but then again, maybe my opinion on that will change as we go on. Maybe this is just normal and I'm not realizing it. I do think that like episode 1 and 3 were particularly strong, uh, with the double with in episode 1 having the double construction form with Snecko Eye, and fastest dead branch in the west we had Dead Branch, uh, which was really early, so we were able to build into that and just win with that. But a lot of these other ones, even though they felt strong, we still did have to work for them. In fact, I would like to go into it real quick though. I'm sorry, I'm trying to prevent that from happening. I'm recording this in full screen so that we can see, so we can see certain things better. But it does mean that if I move the mouse towards the top of the screen, it will open up the tab list, and I know that's not great to watch, but hey. So real quick, we got our in the spreadsheet we have the run times and the deck size on this screen. I was originally planning to have a lot more stuff here, but hadn't really thought of anything just general to put here. I have a lot of stuff like deck contents, card win rates, relic win rates, and all that stuff in these other spreadsheets, or these other spreadsheets. But for here, we can notice that we have a few things. Like for example, our fastest run so far was Slime Boss's Blessing, where we got Tiny Bowler Hat in Act 1. I originally thought that the speed run episode was going to be the fastest with Dead Branch, but I guess the fact that we didn't have to spend so much time in Act 1 in Slime Boss's Blessing, that probably made up for a lot of the time that we would have lost otherwise. So yeah, we cut like a whole 20 minutes off of that one. And then our longest run was Unusual Boss Relics. That was our Sacred Bark Pandora's Box run. I'm not really sure. Oh wait, no, that wasn't even it. That was 3 Citrines, 1 Act, where we hit just below 3 hours. It's probably because we had to spend so much time building up strength. Our largest deck was in our first episode with a good start, which kind of makes sense. You know, you can afford to do that with Snecko Eye. And our smallest deck was Light Yet Effective Brace build. And if you don't remember exactly what's going on here, that's fine. I'm going to move on to this sheet here. I want to just go over some of these real quick. For example, like one of the things I want to talk about is just deck types. Usually in Slay the Spire, even though even though best play is not to aim for any specific kind of deck, like going like on Ironclad, going a full strength build or going a full exhaust build, you do still end up with a sort of dominant part of your strategy that you can sort of say, okay, this ended up being an X build. Like maybe in some rare cases you had a Rampage build that you went into, even though exhaust is a big part of that. Rampage would be like the biggest powerhouse, and you build around that. So for something like this, I would call this just a Sneko run. Uh, we had a lot of just plain old value cards with construction forms. We just got a bunch of really expensive cards into play, and just made use of the raw value that those cards provided. Uh, yeah, it wasn't a difficult run. We got 3 Spheric Shields with Quantum Chamber. We got a Prepare Crush. We got Construction Forms. We got a couple of Shield Chargers, which aren't as great with Sneko, but they still provide a lot of block regardless. And of course we had Vent Steam for Vulnerable. So yeah, very strong run there. Also got a bunch of really strong relics. We got Deflecting Bracers, which we didn't actually build into. We got Impeccable Pecs with tons of strength, so that gave us tons of temporary HP. Yeah, just overall, very, very strong run. Not really much to say there other than Sneko Eye. I guess the 2 times construction form is a pattern that we'll see later. I've had a lot of runs with multiple construction forms, even just 2. The fact that you only need 1 buffer total in order to keep the strength coming. You can lose both the buffers from one and then 1 buffer from the second and still keep your strength coming. And you can stay safe the entire time that happens. Buffer is really strong and very consistent once you have multiple stacks. Second episode might not be easy to tell from this card list, which, by the way, I hope you can read properly. I know the text is kind of small. I'll make sure to check this out by the time we get to 20 runs, because I'm planning on doing this every 10 runs. Just as a quick intermission between all of these sets of runs. It's a little bit hard to tell from the card list what we got here, but in the actual run, it turned out to be a very block-heavy build. It was a very slow, very defensive build. We got Calipers near the end of Act 2 before we died to Hermit 2, and they were doing so much work. We probably would have died a lot earlier if not for Calipers. I mean, in that fight, specifically. I had said before in the recap that if I had picked the Automatons package from Compile package, that we might have won that fight. But thinking about it, like, I think that definitely gave us a chance, but in order to win that fight, we still would have had to hit that package or some kind of scaling that we didn't already have. Maybe the Orb Walkers package would have been good with some extra strength. We also had a decent amount of stasis, which let us mitigate the problems from Makeshift Battery. I felt like that we were killing things in a fashion that we could deal with statuses by the time we drew back to them. And I was even comfortable enough to take a bunch of gems. But yeah, this was basically a very defensive build. It just didn't pan out. I would have been very interested to see how that would have panned it out, how it would have made use of the defense. A single body slam would have been awesome, but there are other ways. If you find ways to scale up slowly, maybe with temporary buff becoming permanent, we could have done something with that. Especially since we had taken Dex and Strength gems. I think I was planning to do more funny things with Dex and Ward for even more block. Just didn't get the chance. I think maybe late in this series I'll come back to losses like that and replay those seeds with the new knowledge that I've gained from from playing the series and being and reflecting on everything that's been happening in it and what I've learned, of course. So we'll have to see if I can actually win that time. This was a Dead Branch deck, not much to say here. Like I said, these first and third episodes are the first and third episodes were very strong for very simple reasons. Dead Branch being this one, building into a very early Dead Branch. In fact, it was the earliest we could get with a boss swap. I guess unless we got Calling Bell or something, but whatever. Dead Branch at floor 6 was super easy to build into. And then, of course, with a 4th energy, and then getting a 5th energy at the first boss with Coffee Dripper, we could just steamroll anything. Even the Curse helped out with that. So yeah, very, very much Dead Branch. Slime Boss's Blessing. Kind of hard to say what kind of deck this was, other than maybe a Tiny Bowler Hat deck, but that seems weird. Tiny Bowler Hat enabled us to be very picky with our cards. I said that in that episode. In Act 1, it gives you so much value that you can just skip anything that isn't, like, very, very strong. We ended up getting a very early Giga Beam, so that helped out a lot. It looks like a very generic high-value card run. We got Construction Form, Giga Beam, Compile Package, Spheric Shield. Like, what more can you ask for, right? Prepare Crush. Maybe this is just the big attack deck. Maybe that's an accurate way to say it, because Prepare Crush is a 4-cost 35 damage. Giga Beam is the 40 AoE for 3 energy. Then, of course, Compile Package can give you even more. Spheric Shield and Construction Form are the big block cards. Yeah, just very much a value card run. The number 5 being the Stasis build. I find this interesting. I definitely would call this a Stasis build, but as far as Stasis builds in general go, they're not all the same. Like, they have very similar enablers, like Future Plans or Planning and Time Capacitor and all that kind of stuff. Stasis Strike would also be one. But even if that's like the most dominant thing about your deck, you still have to sort of make the win happen. Like having 6 stasis slots and then putting a bunch of cards into them to get them back for free is very strong by itself. But you know, you're not having most of the time you're not going to have specific cards that are stasis reliant or stasis synergistic. You're just getting raw value from it. So here, even though I don't really see any absurdly strong cards here, just having a bunch of 0 costs makes it very easy. Maybe card spam is sort of the thing that we're leaning into here. Let's see, anything else about this? Honestly, no, it just looks like we were just abusing stasis. I will say, though, that another part of stasis is that once you get all those cards out of your hand, or out of your deck, into stasis, you're left with a very small deck, on top of all the cards that you're getting rid of in other ways, such as powers and exhaust cards. So, you know, being able to draw back to cards that have just good value is really strong. Also, we had 2 repulsors. I guess we had that because of Permit. One was even bottled. But yeah, it's not easy to characterize a stasis run as anything other than a stasis run, even though it doesn't really mean too much more. As long as you have good cards, you can make a lot of things work with that. Maybe there's a relic? We got Tiny Bowler Hat in Act 2, after Act 2. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything incredibly outstanding here either. We got a few good relics like Bag of Prep, Meat on the Bone. This is apparently misspelled. Got Gambling Chip, Bottled Tornado, of course. Yeah, not really much to say. I guess Idol of Retromation in Act 1 was a bit of a it wasn't as much of a hassle as I thought it would be, even though it's not quite an energy, in my opinion. But yeah. I think we'll see more of these stasis builds, and maybe we'll see more interesting combinations. But as far as this goes, it's very, like, as long as you just have stasis slots, you're probably going to win. Okay, this one, 3 Citrines, 1 Act. We got very lucky with our gems. and with the one Grimforge event. It was another 2 construction form run, which I guess is just, it's going to be dominant if you have 2 construction forms, no matter what else you do. You're going to want to put things into your deck that attack more than once, like our 2 floating orbs. Very much a strength deck. What else do we even have here? It doesn't look like we had too much other ways to block. We could just rely on construction form so much. And since Guardian has built-in defensive mode, block, you can prevent yourself from losing those buffers too early in a Niao fight. And anything else is just gonna die. Did we have anything else to block? Oh yeah, we had 2 shield chargers. That'll do it. Yeah. Just keep the buffers for a few turns and you're solid. That's really all you need to do. I guess if I can learn anything from this, it's the fact that I left an empty slot in Prismatic Spray. I maybe should be a little bit less picky with the gems. But then again, this was the only slot left that didn't have one. And, a 2x attack is not bad, especially if it gains you 1 energy. We had Runic Pyramid this run too, so that helped a lot. Getting 3 Citrines in Act 1 into an Act 1 Runic Pyramid is just very, very nice combination. That being said, I did realize that putting the energy into cards that already cost energy kind of lowered how good the energy actually was, but we still made it work. This was technically, I would call, a 3 energy run. We kept our bronze gear because of the Act 1 Ironclad. We had Runic Pyramid, and we had Idol of Retribution, which I still sort of count as a 3 energy, as a 0 energy relic. It's very inconsistent. Doesn't really feel like a real energy. But that being said, it's still useful. Maybe I'll change my mind on how much energy that actually represents over the course of a run. Right now, I would probably call it like a quarter of an energy. Even though, it's not that simple. It's a quarter of an energy plus utility, I guess. Alright, this one is our smallest deck. We had just a very simple combination of Spheric Shield and Revenge Protocol. I would call this a brace run, because our deck was so small that we were able to get back to our other bracing cards, namely Curl Up and is it Roll Attack? No, it's Resilient Plate Plus. The card that I took at almost the last minute. I think I took it late in Act 3 because I felt like I needed it, and then it paid off very well. The permanent 8 brace, as well as the debuff reduction sometimes paying off, was a very strong combination. And being able to, with a small deck, being able to get back to those cards over and over, especially with the body slams, which like being redrawn and played. Going into defensive, we were able to generate enough block for the body slams to be effective, not offensive. But yeah, it just all worked out. The 2 floating orbs was interesting. Where did I have extra strength coming from? Did I even have any, or was I just taking that? I have, I had the Red Heart Blessing and a Vajra, so that was making them do 8 damage each. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't see any other ways to gain strength in the deck, except for Revenge Protocol, so I guess that was also a consideration. If we can go into defensive enough times, then Revenge Protocol will give us another 2 strength, making our floating orbs do 12 damage each. I think the extra floating orbs actually backfired against us. If I remember correctly, we were fighting Silent in Act 3, maybe? So we were going to deal with Niao with Thorns. I don't 100% remember. Even with all this work put into this spreadsheet, there's still a lot that gets left out. It would be so much work to put every detail into this, even though I want it to be like useful information. Right now, honestly, the best that this spreadsheet is doing is just kind of serving as a historical record of the runs rather than showing a lot of useful stuff. Like, for example, like we have all these card win rates and relic win rates, but like if the trend continues that we have a very high win rate, even somewhere around 80%, it might be hard to extrapolate anything from that. because in order to actually get data, you need to know how many times the card is going to work versus how many it doesn't. And I had if I had like 100% win rate, then every card is going to look good and every relic is going to look good because you just don't lose. So figuring out exactly what to do with that is going to be interesting. Unusual boss relics. This was, I guess the boss relics weren't too unusual, but the circumstances that we took them definitely were. I've taken Sacred Bark multiple times in this series already, which is a little bit interesting. I wonder if it's better on Guardian than other characters, or if it's just been coincidence. But yeah, the Act 1 Sacred Bark being being an unusual pick, I think, still counts. A lot of people don't like this relic, probably because it's very hard to get actual value out of it in most scenarios. The times that I find it's most effective are in boss fights, when you're saving potions for long-term fights, especially stuff like Power Potion, Strength Potion, Dex Potion. Sacred Bark, doubling the effects of that for boss fights means that you get so much value out of it. Yeah, and those are like the hardest fights to plan for most of the time. But going into Act 2, you are mostly going to be scared of the hallway fights, and maybe even the elites that you need to survive. And Sacred Bark can be useful in those, but it's very difficult for it to be because potions are so varied, and potions that actually help in those fights are they have varying degrees of success. They ask you to do something specific. Hallway fights especially want you to have front-loaded attack damage front-loaded damage and front-loaded block. So the potions that would win those fights are potions that can do that, and there's not actually that many that can reliably do that. There's a decent amount, but not enough for it to be consistent in saving you. But that being said, we had White Beast Statue in this scenario, and I don't think our other boss relics were that great. I think we had Calling Bell and something else. Calling Bell would have been interesting, but I think going into Act 2, I was still a little bit concerned about our survival. So actually taking the Sacred Bark there to guarantee with the guarantee of White Beast Statue's potions every combat, I think being able to juggle the potions in scenarios that we would want them to be in helped out a lot. I don't think there's any world in which it was going to help every fight, but just allowing us to survive most of the fights was enough for it to work out. And then, of course, in Act 3, we still had most of our strikes and defends. Whenever that happens, I wonder if I made a mistake with my pathing. Maybe I need to be a little bit more aggressive with the shops or events to look for more removes. But that being said, going into Act 3 with 7 out of our 8 strikes and defends and finding a Pandora's box was very good. It also gave us a pretty good set of cards, if I remember correctly. I think there was like one that I was kind of iffy on, and the rest were very good, or extremely good. We even got to I think we even got Fierce Bash from that, which I wasn't completely thrilled about because we were because a lot of cards were fighting for stasis. But we picked up an emergency. I don't remember if that was from Pandora's box or from a card pick, but having that helped out a lot as well. So we were actually able to make use of Fierce Bash. I think in Niao I probably did somewhere around 200, 250 damage. I don't 100% remember. Maybe it did more. But it was relevant. It was relevant in other fights too, even though it was slow. So, hard to complain about that, even though it's kind of a bad card. So yeah, making sometimes these decisions get very, very interesting. I think at high level play, a lot of people think that you have to follow a meta of some kind in order to win at these high levels. But the better I get at the game, the more it feels like these decks are actually getting more diverse. When you get better at the game, you realize in what situations things do work, as well as in what situations don't work. I think the climb from Ascension 1 to Ascension 20, or Ascension 0 to Ascension 20 even, it's very punishing because it tells you a lot about what doesn't work. So you know, you kind of get that feeling repeated to you over and over as you're also improving. Uh, but now that I'm at the A20 level and playing there consistently, uh, and also increasing my knowledge with watching other people play on YouTube or Twitch, or just discussing it with people on Discord, I'm finding new ways to make things work. For example, been I think the biggest thing that's been an influence recently was watching Tricky, another YouTube channel who specializes in making infinites and small decks and all that kind of stuff. Uh, Showed whenever I started watching his videos, it kind of showed me how being really picky about your cards and removing even more often than what I was already doing was not just viable, but maybe even a good play most of the time. Uh, I started to realize just how much I didn't need to take extra cards in order to beat certain fights in Act 1. Just how, and learning how to evaluate, uh, I guess, intuitively how powerful I was, uh, and if I could beat a certain fight that was coming up, like the boss or an elite. And if I knew that I could do that, I could either skip cards I don't need or invest in the future even more, taking something that might be even a curse for the time being simply because I can afford it for it to pay off later. And I think that was and I think that that's been a really big influence on me because I know that I'm playing Guardian specifically, and card removes. Well, not card removes. I guess. Okay, I was thinking gems. Gems are technically card removes whenever you socket them. Gems in particular make it very easy for Guardian to have a small deck, and the small deck experience is only compounded with stasis, eating some of your cards. Uh, but even so, I found that hovering somewhere between the the early 20s and late 20s of number of cards in your deck makes for probably the most interesting decks that I have seen so far in the game. Uh, Before I started playing Guardian, I was having or before I even played it modded, I was having consistently 30 card decks, 30 to 35 card decks, and that I think that might be usual for something for the main characters, especially if you've watched Baylor Lord play. I've watched a lot of him, and he usually hovers around that range for at least the first three characters. I'm not sure about Watcher. I don't watch Watcher, uh, but those especially uh, get into big deck territory. So what I've realized happens is that in small decks, somewhere around below 20, but especially below 15 cards, you are you have a deck that is full of just a bunch of very strong cards or a very strong combination. And the number of those that actually work are very small. It can end up feeling very samey, uh, at least to me. And what's really interesting is that in the mid 30 card range and higher, you actually have a very similar experience to that. Because whenever you take that many cards in your deck, you're looking for you're basically trying to guarantee that you survive, and the best way to do that is to just take more value cards, or cards that build into your build if you have a strong direction. So finding either those strong value cards or that strong combination that pattern still shows up in those large decks, because that's like the only way that you can survive at that number. You have to spend so many turns drawing through all those cards before you get to shuffle and see those cards again. So basically, you have to guarantee that you have those good cards or good combinations. But in this low 20 to high 20 card range, I've noticed that there's a lot of it's out of the range of both of those, where you end up with very, very interesting combinations, because every card is working for you. But so it's taking uh, the small deck quality of having cards that work for you, but also the large deck quality that you lack 100% consistency. So you sort of have to pull the win from your deck in that, and because you're forced to do that, it doesn't end up with the obvious combinations. Like, even in these 10 runs, playing at A20, even though Guardian has a lot of strong cards that are like a very high variance in their card quality, it still ends up being very unique between runs. I don't think that any runs out of these 10 have been what I would call the same, or similar enough to call the same. All of them have felt different and distinct from each other. And honestly, I remember feeling that way about every run I've had up until this point. I don't think there's been, well, maybe not every run. There's been maybe a few runs that have felt very samey. But even if I were to make something like a Fierce Bash deck, something that revolved around Fierce Bash, had a bunch of Accelerate in order to get it back out and put it back in again, it would still take more aspects of the deck for it to feel like the same deck as something else. Because even if I have what I would call a Fierce Bash deck, that still only handles the damage aspect of the deck. The defense aspect is a whole other aspect. The amount of setup and scaling I have and utility are also extra aspects that don't necessarily affect how I use the Fierce Bash, even though it would be the main defining part of the deck. So it still ends up feeling unique to me, which I think is really cool. And even though, like, number 10 here, I had 4 protocol cards and I would call it a protocol deck, it's still, it's still a cool experience. Because sometimes I think getting those very simplistic, very linear, I think you know what I mean. Getting those kinds of decks with very straightforward archetypes every so often can still be very interesting. It's like, oh cool, this still works, even though you're not used to having that happen. Because leaning too far into one archetype is very hard to actually make work. You're not often going to be offered the cards in order to do that. But the times it happens is still fun. Anyways, number 9. Number 9, I titled Unclogging the Pyramid. Even though I didn't really talk about it much in the episode, I ended up with 4 strikes and 4 defense, zero starter cards removed. And I had to deal with multiple curses over the course of the run. I had Doubt and Pain and Injury, 2 of which I removed, but still didn't have enough to get rid of the rest. And I didn't even have an energy relic except for the curse key that I swapped into. And, a 4th energy helps a lot with Pyramid, but it still can leave room to clog up in the late game. So how we solved that was with multiple suspensions and a planning and just ways to put things into stasis. It essentially acted as a larger hand size. It's kind of like doing what Pyramid is doing, but maybe a little bit worse. But that's fine, because as long as you put the cards that you want to put into stasis, then there's not really much of a downside to it. So being able to, this is another example of one of those very interesting moments where even if I didn't realize it at the time, the deck was suffering from clog from bad cards, and we still made it work, despite that being one of Pyramid's most major downsides. If you don't have a way to deal with hand clog, then you have a problem. But most of the time, the way to deal with hand clog is to remove the bad cards, and we didn't. We worked with them. I think as far as just our actual damage and block plan went, what do we have here? We even had a Twin Slam with energy for a 0-cost card. That ended up working out very, very well. I was happy that not making the Dex Ward combo was a good choice. We also had Vent Steam with Ward and Dex, though. We had Oh yeah, that was the run that we ended up using multi-beam in the hard fight because we had so many cards exhausted from Haunted. Another downside of Pyramid in the Downfall version of the game, or the Downfall campaign. Uh, so even though multi-beam hadn't really been a carrying card up until this point, it had sort of been supplemental damage. It ended up being the main damage and won us the fight. So that was really cool. We ended up with Revenge Protocol Spheric Shield again. I didn't realize how much I was taking Revenge Protocol until recently, and I think my opinion on that card has gone up. I'm not really a fan of any of the protocols because the times that you go into defensive are very few in a fight. So getting like sparse one-turn benefits from the protocols is really not appealing to me. But that being said, Revenge Protocol being a rare that braces for 5 every turn is a huge step up from one that braces 3. So I feel like that card is actually pretty powerful. 2 turns of Revenge Protocol plus Curl Up by themselves can go into defensive. And even if you don't get that exactly, by the time you draw back to Curl Up, you can probably go into defensive a second time in a fight. So that's pretty cool. Yeah. Hey, that was another Sacred Bark run. Yeah, sometimes, yeah, taking Sacred Bark after Act 2 is a lot more common, I think, because by then you can afford the late game power of the Sacred Bark provides. Longer fights. There's a set of 4 longer fights at the end of the game. You got the 2 boss fights from Act 20 in Ascension 20 in Act 3. Then you have the Act 4 Elite fight and the Niao fight, or the Heart fight, depending on your campaign. So yeah, taking that after Act 2 is a lot more common. It's almost like we switched it in Unusual Boss Relics. Getting Pandora's Box after Act 1 and then Sacred Bark after Act 2 would have been a lot more reasonable. But we still made it work the other way around. And then, of course, I mentioned the protocol run. Us having 4 protocols. This was interesting because we ended up just doing damage very quickly normally, and then just relying completely on scaling block for our block system. That worked very well simply because we had Horncleat and Pantograph, those 2 relics together early on in the game made us very defensive. So we didn't have to take as much front load defense, which is really good to get early in a game, because then you can just completely speculate into the late game and then not have to deal with that problem either. So that's what we did, and we ended up with 14 brace a turn. That felt like a really good number. I'll have to keep that in mind for later. If I decide to lean into another brace per turn block strategy like that. That being said, we did still need that panic button, so I'm glad we found that. The secret technique also helped. This is the run where the Suspicious Merchant actually paid off super hard. I think the evaluation of that event was correct. And I don't know if I said this during that episode, but something I realized a good way to picture it was that since we were doing such a specialized deck where our offense was very strong and very straightforward, very unga bunga, our defense being almost exclusively scaling and not front load, since we had such a specialized deck, adding utility to that to cover any other things that we need to do, I think was the reason that the cards that we got worked so well, or colorless cards, I guess, in general. We did kind of high roll with those. We got Flash of Steel, which was a cantrip, and Secret Technique, which worked with our panic button. But even so, I think that looking for that particular situation where we have very specialized ways to do what we do and not generalized is a great time to take those. Because a lot of the time, those cards are not front load or scaling. They're in this weird state where evaluating them is very difficult. So I think this is a useful evaluation to work with for now. And maybe over the rest of the series, if that is actually incorrect, we can make a more informed decision or a more informed evaluation because we had a starting point to work with. Also, this is the run where we finally took 3 tackles, which was cool. Anything else to say about this one? I guess not. So yeah, overall I think we had a very wide spread of deck types. I'm wondering how often each of these kinds of decks are going to come up. So yeah. Moving on real quick. Card win rates, relic win rates. I'm not really going to go over these. We've had 10 runs, which is a very, very small sample size, especially because not every card and not every relic was taken every run. So some of these have like half or less pick rates. And having this kind of win rate, 90% after 10 runs, obviously it's not going to say 100% what's going to happen here. I decided to like do some math on a website about this. I'm not an expert in statistics, so I might have gotten this wrong, but with a 9 out of 10 win rate, a 90% win rate over 10 runs, the chance that there's a 90, in order to get like a 95% certainty rating, and by certainty rating I mean like what my true win rate could be versus what actually happened. My true win rate could be anywhere between like 99% and 56%. So, and that's because we've only had 10 runs. So that's very widespread. At least I'm kind of certain that I have an over 50% win rate, which is cool. In fact, I'm willing to bet that we have at least a 60%. Maybe going above that is a bit might be a bit I don't know the word I'm looking for here. Might be a bit early to say, but I do know that. But I am pretty confident to say that 60% at the least is what we got going here. I think these first 2 wins contributed a lot to that, since they were both very, very strong runs that were kind of handed to me with the Snekawai and the Dead Branch, at least with what we had that time. I'm glad that a lot of these runs end up being interesting, at least for me. Even this one was kind of interesting, even though it lost. So that makes me feel positive about the rest of the series and the direction it's going. But anyways, since we don't really have very useful information from this, and if this trend continues, if I got somewhere around a 90% win rate, the win rates of these cards and relics are not going to be very useful to look at. I think maybe there will be a few that are, but I think those will be like the outlier cards that are already understood to not be very strong. It would be the cases where I either made a wrong decision to take a card when I shouldn't have, or it'll be cards that are already understood to be weak, that will show up in the information to actually be useful because of the losses that we have. So with that in mind, I'm worried that all this work that I'm putting into the spreadsheet for win rates is not going to be useful. A lot of what I'm doing is trying to figure out how strong each card is on Guardian for balance reasons, because I want to contribute to the balancing of this character in some way. And at high level, I feel like it's very important to look at a high level. But a very important part of this is also pick rate. Pick rate might be a more, it might be a closer estimation of how strong these cards are, because how often I take them is how often I feel they're good. And if you have a good win rate, then most of the time your pick rate is going to be very indicative of how strong a card actually is. But that being said, pick rate is not necessarily just how many times I had this card versus how many times how many times I had the card versus how many runs I've done. because sometimes I just won't be offered that card. So including those runs in the pick rate is kind of misleading. Uh, the most accurate way to look at the pick rate would be to look at the individual card rewards at each floor, or the shops at each floor that I have a shop where those cards were offered and I chose to take them versus when I chose not to take them. But that is so much work to put into the spreadsheet. I would need some kind of program to do that because I'm not willing to put in that much time. This already takes a decent chunk of my time to do as is. Putting this in, and then the deck contents in this format, then taking those and putting them into each of these spreadsheets. It takes a good couple hours, and this is still a hobby in my eyes. More, even though it's a project, it's still a hobby and not something I want to dominate my life with right now. I think the most useful thing I have right now is actually the tab with the notable moments in it. Having all of these notes that I take when rewatching the episodes, which thankfully I can watch at multiplied speeds, so I don't spend another 3 hours watching each video to see where I made mistakes or had interesting moments. But that being said, even that's kind of hard to go through unless you keep up with the series the whole way. And especially for me, going through all of these as sort of a synopsis, going through these for an episode is very time consuming. Honestly, I wish I had written down some of the lessons that I had learned from these episodes, because I remember certain things about pathing or about fights in particular. Even in this first episode, I got roll attack and priming shot. That's something I learned could make a strong combo that I sincerely had not realized up until I started the series. Could do that. In retrospect, it's obvious. Two common cards, two common attacks that add up to more than 10 brace. That should tip you off. But I guess I kind of wrote them off because they're common attacks. But now I know about that combination, and even paid off, I think, in the first couple of episodes after that episode came out. I was able to look for that combination again and factor it into my decision making. There are other lessons. I think it might be better to just let you read through this if you want to. That's pretty much the best that I can think to do right now. Maybe I'll figure something out for later ones. But yeah, if I were to read through all these and just give you my thoughts on it, I've already got my thoughts down. So that being said, I do think that there are some interesting things in here. A lot of my thoughts that I write down are actually very different than what I was thinking about in the moment. I see some suboptimal plays that I didn't see while playing, and correct them in this, even though most of the time they do work out. I guess one of the things that's coming to mind right now is how I keep forgetting to sometimes use HP as brace. There have been times where I've remembered to, but there have been a few fights where I've forgotten, so keeping an eye out for that is important. So let's see, what next? I guess that sort of feeds into the format that I'm doing this, the fact that I'm making videos and commentating over them while I play. It's actually, I've noticed that it's improved my my overall strategy. I noticed that whenever I play in by myself and not saying everything out loud, that it becomes very easy to not see the big picture, or maybe not see completely, but more to what am I thinking about here? It's definitely harder to make decisions. I've spent a whenever I play by myself, I find myself sitting at a single decision, usually a card reward of some kind, for a long time. And eventually I got tired of doing that, and so whenever I had encountered a decision like that, I would just kind of put the game away for a while and come back to it. But here in this series, I've kind of felt that pressure of sitting at a single reward for a while and thinking about it really hard, but making a decision anyways. But it has felt easier to do that, so that's really cool, I think. The cost, though, is that I've been making more microplay decisions, uh, like in combat decisions or sometimes pathing. I've noticed that I do stuff a bit too late because I'm focused on talking and getting the words out of my mouth. And sometimes I end up thinking about what exactly I want to say rather than just saying what's on my mind. It gets very easy to get lost in that because I want to articulate myself in a way that I'm happy with. Uh, so then it becomes very easy to focus on that and then lose focus on what I'm actually doing. Uh, I think as the series progresses, I'm going to try to do better at that. Mostly in a way that's like maybe I'll slow down, maybe I'll stop talking for a minute and just let myself reset. I will try to keep in mind not to make long, not to leave long periods of silence when that happens. But I do want to make sure that I don't make a really dumb mistake that costs me a run. So far, that hasn't happened. Not even in episode 2. I think that was just a play that I wouldn't have seen anyways. But there were other things, like in the one book of stabbing fight, where I had a doubled flex potion, and I forgot that it was doubled because I had Sacred Bark. That was very avoidable if I had thought a little bit more and paid more attention. But in working through my thoughts and saying them out loud to fill silence, it became very difficult to remember that. So, moving forward, we'll try to fix that as well. But it's a universal struggle for people that commentate over their gameplay. I've heard so many people I've watched play any game say that. So yeah, it's not. I feel comfort in the fact that it's not just me. But regardless, I would like to fix it. This tab is just for my personal things, about things that I would want to add to this series or to this spreadsheet. So, sorry, that's going to remain a secret. So now, on to the fun part of the video. We got our tier list. I will leave a link to this tier list maker in the description in case you want to do it yourself. And also, I will leave a link to an image of the completed tier list, my completed tier list, so that if you don't want to watch this whole thing and just see how I rank things, or if you want to see how I rank things first before I go into it and just see my reasoning afterwards, you can go look at it now. I'm not going to force you to sit through everything just to see what you wanted to see. But with that out of the way, if you're still here and watching, let's get into this. I did just mention about how commentating is sometimes difficult. This I was particularly worried about because I didn't like making a tier list is difficult. So, and knowing how to rank things completely accurately for me, I think would be difficult. I could just end up sitting here and thinking about it for a while. So what I did is I did it in private first and kind of just made myself a preliminary thing. I have an image that I'm going to pull up on my phone and work with as a template. That being said, it's probably going to change a little bit now that I'm doing this right now. First things first, I guess. Tier lists are they have a history in the STS community of being unreliable for playing the game. And I think that was because whenever people started coming into Slay the Spire, they treated it a lot like they treat other games, card games especially, where certain cards are definitely so much better than others, you want to build into a certain deck archetype whenever you play and make something very strong. But because it's the card game, they sort of miss the roguelike aspect of it, where you are building your deck up over time. You are given maybe not the best options to work with, and you have to just use what you're given. So what people ended up thinking about tier lists is that when they look at a tier list, these players are just going to look at the tier list, take the cards that are near the top, not take the ones at the bottom, and then they're just not going to win. Or they're not going to do well because every card really has its own situation where it's useful. Even cards in F tier that are going to be down here, every card has a situation, and combinations of cards especially are much more powerful than individuals, at least most of the time. So understanding how those work is very important. However, recently in the community there's also been this sort of pushback that tier lists are useful, just not in the way that they had been viewed before. So what this tier list is going to highlight is card balance, at least in my opinion, and of course in my own playstyle. How good a card is in most situations, or in the situations where they matter. And I'll get more into that while we do this tier list. So I have these sorted by rarity here, and also have the gems at the end of each one since they're a little bit more abstract. When you look at the tier list maker, they're not going to be in order. I'm sorry about that. There's no way I can change that as far as I know. But yeah, let's get into this real quick. First up, we have Charge Core. I know that these images are going to be a little bit small. I'm sorry about that again. Hopefully the image, the completed image will be bigger. I'll find a way to make it more, I'll make it more visible. I'll try to read off what each of these do, just so you remember, though. Charge Core, deal 10 damage, place into stasis, and when it's in stasis, draws a card every turn, until it explodes. Let's see, where did I put that? Okay, that's what I thought. This card, I believe, is an A tier. It is very efficient damage for its cost, and even though it exhausts when it's in defensive, my gosh, when it's in stasis, it's still, the drawing a card passively every turn is still really good. Even when you're on 3 energy, drawing cards passively, I think, is a lot more important than drawing them actively for 1 cost. Spending 2 energy when you've just drawn cards in your hand gets a lot more difficult the more good cards that you've added to your deck. Because, for example, if you have 4 good cards, and one of them draws 2, you draw 2 with that card and you draw both of your other good cards when you had 1 in your hand already. Suddenly you have 2 energy and 3 good cards in your hand and you can't play them all. You're going to have to wait for the deck to reshuffle and get back to them. Meanwhile, since this waits to draw a card for a turn, and then draws a card after that turn as well, you don't have that problem as much. You just get the burst damage that you wanted that turn. That's what you took the card for. And then you get the added benefits of card draw that you usually like to have later. I guess this is a good time to highlight there are different, that card draw comes in different forms and actually solves different problems. Like, a lot of people value burst card draw. I think even the meta of the main game is starting to move towards just take cards that you can combo one big turn into. Take cards that give you immediate value. Don't care about the future turns as much. Work on what you can combo into immediately so that you can face any enemy on turn 1 and just not have to worry about what they're doing. And while that is a very valuable strategy, it has downsides. The upside, of course, is that you are able to draw to your powerful cards faster. That is a very big consideration. Of course, being able to play all those cards is another thing. That would be the downside that I believe that has. Usually you can fix that with the cards that you take on those characters. For example, Ironclad's Bloodletting has been recently rising in my personal opinion, and I think the opinions of others as well. Silent has been going harder into discard, and that includes energy generating cards such as Concentrate and Tactician, and Defect Fission has been rising in the eyes of popular content creators, as well as, Defect's abundance of energy generation with turbo and double energy and all that kind of stuff. So if you have ways to generate energy, that's great. I don't think Guardian has any, except for Citrine. I might be incorrect on that. But looking through these cards, I don't see anything. If we find one later, I'll correct myself. But anyway, that's one kind of card draw. The other kind of card draw that is most often looked down on is passive card draw. And that kind of card draw is on stuff like Machine Learning, Brutality, Tools of the Trade, and of course Charge Core. Now, a lot of people's evaluations early on in this game were, okay, you're -1 card when you draw the card that when you draw this card. Then you gain 1 draw next turn, and then you go even. Then the turn after that, you finally go positive. And so you're not getting any benefit until the third turn. This is incorrect. You are absolutely getting value out of this card. Obviously, this has burst damage attached to it, but the kind of card draw that it provides is a different kind. It's providing you consistency on those turns that you get the extra cards. It will not get you to your good cards faster unless you have a big deck and you draw it early. That is true. And while that may be the more popular and perhaps even arguably stronger kind, this still has a place. If you draw 6 cards on turn 2 when you know the enemy is going to be having a strong turn 2, which is actually pretty often. That's why Horncleave is such a good relic. It's actually the best out of the 3 block relics of its set. If you have a good turn 2, then you won't have to worry about getting a dead draw as much. And I realize I just made that whole point about turn 2, but that would require you drawing out in turn 1. Regardless, having more consistent turns means that you will lose HP less often. And this helps a lot in hallway fights especially. If you need to survive hallway fights, this scaling card draw can actually do wonders for you. Boss fights maybe a little bit less. In fact, I think, okay, so the fact that the burst card draw can handle any fight really helps. It gives you better turns in hallway fights, at least during one turn, which if you get a really good turn 1, then you probably don't have to worry. And of course, it helps you in the boss fights get your scaling cards. Meanwhile, scaling card draw does help, it just helps only in these shorter fights, or the fights that require you to be a lot more polarized in what you're able to do. Requires you to draw to your burst cards instead, or your front load cards. So having more consistency will save you in those fights. And I think that this is especially important for this card. Having more consistency in the early game is great, on Guardian especially. You can lose a lot of HP to certain fights if you're not careful. Also, a lot of boss swaps have an energy attached to them. So having a 4th energy with 6 cards in hand increases the power of that 4th energy as well. You will have better card choices. You won't have to worry as much about drawing a dead card such as Ascender's Bane. And of course, you do still have better turns with your better cards. So I think that even if you have to pay an energy and a card draw to get one of these passive card draw cards, all you need, that's just one turn where you're losing out. Sometimes it's not worth doing. I think a lot of the times it is worth it. I think this makes this card very consistent and powerful. So even though it exhausts, even though it doesn't give you the benefit on the turn, it works very well with Guardian and belongs in A tier. All right, let's speed this up a bit. I guess the further I go along this, the more that the less I'll have to explain. Up next, this is Crystal Ray, which I forget the name of because I almost never take this card. This card is F tier, in my opinion. It deals 10 damage base for 2 energy, and gains 2 additional energy for each gem that you have socketed. So it doesn't even count for stuff that's unsocketed. It has to be socketed. Big problems with this card. The real way that this card works out is as a scaling damage card. It is an enabler, well, not an enabler, no, it gets enabled by other cards once you have a bunch of gems socketed. So it's really great for Act 3 and Act 4 if you're going into gems. So first problem, you're not always going to have a lot of gems. Episode 10 had 2 gems socketed, and they were both in Twin Slam. I had a quartz that was unsocketed too. That's it. And that's actually a pretty, it's a pretty common occurrence. Maybe not the majority occurrence by any means. Maybe not even maybe not even higher than a third of the time. But still, it comes up very often. And as a common card, you are going to be seeing this a lot in Act 1 and Act 2. So you're getting offered this card a lot when you can't really take it. Additionally, the base damage is 10 for 2 energy. This, for reference, this is how much damage Silence Sneaky Strike used to do before patch 2.0 or 2.1, whenever her cards were buffed. And even then, Sneaky Strike got a refund if you played it after discarding a card. And it was still too weak. This is literally the same problem, but worse. It is borderline untakeable for me. I think I've had one good run with this card in all of my time playing Guardian, and then a second run where it was supplementary damage, and that's it. That's the only time. Those are the only times this card has ever been good for me. I think it is untakeable trash. However, I posted actually the tier list maker for Guardian yesterday, my time. You'll be seeing this 2 days after I record it. And there are people that actually like this card. I think one actually put it in S tier, so like that's surprising to me, but also, you know, people's opinions are going to differ. I don't think I know everything, not even close. I think there were actually so many differing opinions on this tier list that maybe a lot of things can work that I'm not aware of yet. But yeah, this is not a card I'm taking. You'll be lucky to see it once in this series, to be completely honest. Alright, up next, Incinerate. Also not a card I take very often. I like the idea of it. It deals 7 damage and accelerates, but it belongs in D tier to me. The reason for this is there's a couple reasons for this. One is that it only accelerates once. A lot of cards that you put into stasis are going to require 2 turns of acceleration in order to come out, because a lot of cards are 1 cost, they go into stasis for 2 turns. So having only 1 accelerate on a card means that you can't put a card into stasis and then immediately get it back out as a 0 cost. And that would be a very strong use of this card. Instead, it fails to do that most of the time, unless you get a very lucky draw order. It requires you to have more stasis available to you in order for it to be useful. Because again, draw order is important. If you only have this with curl up, you're kind of in a bad position. Because if you draw it first, it does nothing. Also, the fact that it does 7 damage, it's only 1 more damage than a strike. So you really need to be taking this for the accelerate. But it can't do much. So, unfortunately, it belongs in D tier. That being said, this has been useful in the past for me sometimes. More often than this, for sure. More often than the Crystal Ray. Most often, when it is useful, is when I can afford to put an Amber into it and make it accelerate twice, because that will nearly guarantee that a card comes out in a timely fashion. I can make card combos with it. The funny thing is that if you have an Amber in it for the second accelerate, and you reroute it, which is the card that if your next card you play is put into stasis, if you reroute this card, then it will bring itself out of stasis if it is the first card, which is kind of funny. You can play it twice. Of course, like that would, even then it would still only be kind of like 7 damage. because you would have to put another card in stasis for the accelerate to be useful. But that being said, it has been funny, and that has been exactly what happens sometimes. So I've definitely taken it a few times. But I'm not going to be taking this as an early card unless I already have stasis support and absolutely need the accelerate. 7 damage is just not enough to justify it for me. 1 second. I usually try to keep water at my table for this, but I forgot to this time, so I had to get some. Alright, up next. Piercing Hide. Gain 7 block and 2 temporary thorns, brace 3. I guess the first thing to talk about here are the numbers. 7 block, 2 temporary thorns. 2 temporary thorns is really low. 7 block is not particularly amazing either, even for a common card, in my opinion. I think it needs to be doing something a little bit more useful than what it's doing. It's trying to do like 3 things at once and not doing very good at all, any of them. I have taken this in the past as a card going into Act 2, because Act 2 requires that you block a little bit more than Act 1. You can't just take a bunch of damage cards going into Act 2. You need a way to block, or else you're going to hit for like 20 plus damage every time you enter a fight. It's not going to be fun for you. I think that's the reason why Act 2 is so hard for a lot of people. I mean, it's hard for me too, but like, if you focus too much on Act 1 and beating the elites and the boss there, and just not focusing on preparing for anything beyond that, then you're going to suffer. This is a way to prepare for that. But that being said, the numbers are very small, like I had already said. Brace 3 is not impressive. 2 temporary thorns is really low for a card that gives thorns. I think even Slime Boss's shield spikes, Spiky Shield? I don't remember what it's called. It gives you 7 block and 4 temporary thorns. And you know, that's actually kind of effective. Even though I haven't really taken the card much, but I don't play Slime Boss much. And 7 block being only 2 more than a defend, I don't take this card very often. But I do think it has more uses than Incinerate. It has uses. It's below average in my opinion. I think more often than not I don't take it. Sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. I don't think even the socket is that useful. Most of the time sockets like on Incinerate or others are like on common attacks or 0 cost cards. And then you have very useful things to put into them, such as wards. Wards are like the biggest thing that you can put into those to increase consistency. Meanwhile, this is already a block card, so I usually end up putting a Thorns into it, Thorns gem. Sometimes I put a Brace gem into it if I'm like desperate, or occasionally like a Strength gem. That one's a little weird though. Spending 1 energy for 2 strength is for 2 temporary strength is not. Doesn't feel that great. So yeah, that stays in C tier, excuse me. Up next, Planning. So Planning is interesting for a few reasons. As an early card, it's really powerful. It maybe doesn't seem that way, but you get 2 cards from your draw pile into stasis. They come out a couple turns later at 0 cost. That's raw value, and it costs 0. Even though it doesn't do anything for you the turn that you draw it, which is a big downside, but a considerable downside, the future power that it provides for you is has been, in my experience, very strong. I don't know if I can 100% justify why that is, or explain why that is. Playing 2 cards for free, 2 random cards for free is generally pretty good though, to spend a card on. Especially at 0 energy. The socket also makes it very interesting. You can put pretty much any temporary buff into the card. You can also put something like a Quartz into it to make it draw a card and as a cantrip. You can put a Garnet in for AoE vulnerable for 1 turn. This as a 0 cost card, the socket has a lot of potential. The real downsides of the card is that you don't know what's going into stasis. unless you have a way to look at the draw pile, like with pre-program or with Frozen Eye, which are both very, very rare. There might be even a way to put something back into your draw pile. I don't remember. Like I know a few characters have headbutt cards. I don't think Guardian has one though. If you know what you're going to draw, it's very good. But sometimes, and this has happened to me several times, you end up putting something into stasis that you didn't want, such as your construction form. Suddenly it's stuck there for 4 turns, and you can't do anything about it, especially whenever you take planning early on in the game. You're not really going to be taking Accelerate with it because it fills up your stasis slots perfectly with your Curl Up. 2 plus 1 is 3. The other, excuse me. The other downside, of course, is that since it fills up your stasis slots so completely, it becomes very hard to take other ways to use stasis, such as cards like Shield Charger or Charge Up, or things that can put other things into stasis like Pre-Program or Suspension, or Future Plans. Since your stasis slots are so full, you can't take these much better controlled forms of stasis. So, like, the real only thing that's redeeming it is the fact that it's a 0 cost and very powerful. So, like, with all that in mind, my mind is telling me that it belongs in B, but my experience is telling me it belongs in A. So it's going to go in A. I don't 100% know why. Maybe it's the socket. Maybe it's just because it's such a good early card. Sometimes even as good as a late card, because there have been runs for me where I just don't end up taking stasis cards, because that's just not what I've been offered that's good enough. So then late game I get a planning, I'm like, oh, okay, more free value, that's great. But yeah. So yeah, sometimes it feels very powerful to me. Sometimes has downsides. I think most of the time it's going to be very beneficial, and I think it does belong in A. Up next, Piercing Shot, or Priming Shot, rather. I put Priming Shot in C. Right, something I wanted to say about this tier list is that I'm not 100% sold on, like, a lot of these cards and their placements. It's mainly just meant to be a preliminary thing for me to show where I'm at right now at the beginning of the series, and then oh yeah, at the end of the series I'm going to do another one of these updated with everything that I've learned, all my opinions that have changed and all that, just so we can see where we've come from. I think we'll find some very interesting things from that. I've seen plenty of other times where people's evaluations of cards and stuff have changed in a very interesting direction for very interesting reasons. So I could see this moving up to B tier. It's a common attack. It does 8 damage and braces 3. Recently, though, I felt like it's 2 more damage than the common. Sorry, it's 2 more damage than your strike, and you're bracing 3. And it has a socket that may or may not do something. Like, I said how wards can go into these common attacks as a good way to, like, make yourself a little bit more safe, more consistent, but you still need to be able to do that, and there's probably better places to put socketed cards like that. So on its own, it really doesn't do much. In order for this to do something, you need a roll attack, or shield spikes, or resilient plate. Anything that's able to brace the remaining 7, those all brace 8. But bracing 3 with your curl up already in your deck is usually not strong at all. Not even with like HP loss from fights, you are usually not going to lose enough for it to be useful. Let's say you draw curl up and this, and then on your redraw you draw curl up again. That 3 brace meant nothing. You can go into defensive at 20, so you only needed the curl up. If you draw it in reverse order, if you draw both of those cards and then on your redraw you get back priming shot, you would have needed to lose at least 4 HP. And usually, most of the time, you only lose like 2. uh, before then anyways. So we'd have to lose either another 2, or you have to fight Jawworm. Jawworm is probably maybe the one time you take Priming Shot, because you lose 7 HP quite a lot in that fight. It attacks for 12 on turn 1, you get 1 defend, there goes all your HP. So yeah, that would be the 7 damage, then the Brace 3 from this and Curl Up would be 20, exactly. But that being said, I do not feel like this card has given me enough benefit most of the time to want to take it. I took it in a recent episode when it was up against a reroute because I valued reroute much lower. I think that's changed though. I think I actually value the reroute higher, and we'll see that in just a sec. It's a couple cards away. But yeah, this is another case where I don't really feel like this is a great card. I'll take it if I have to. I guess Piercing Hide is the same way. But it does feel like it belongs in C tier. Alright. Up next is Recover. Gained 5 block, Brace 3. Place a card from your discard pile into stasis. So, I know some people that actually like this card quite a bit because of the Recover ability. That being said, I feel like this also belongs in C tier. Gained 5 block is not a great amount of block. It's a defend. Anything that blocks for the same amount as a defend or lower is usually not great for 1 energy. Putting extra defense in the deck is usually not going to work out well. Maybe it'll work out for the first few floors if you're desperate. But on Guardian, who needs some extra damage and also has defensive mode, putting a defend into your deck is not great. Obviously, there is the part that puts a card from your discard into stasis. This is useful sometimes. Definitely, absolutely useful sometimes. The problem here is that you need a good card that you want to put into stasis. And you need to not have played it or put it into stasis already. It can make certain things more consistent. It requires draw order, but does have that ability. The problem is that I don't think there's a lot of cards that you're going to be able to take that want to do that in the first place. Like, for example, if you take like a roll attack, that's great because now you have a Brace 3 card to go into defensive, but if you recover that card, even though it's one of your better attack cards, it's only going to come out in 3 turns. That's a lot of waiting for a card that you've already played. And not really worth putting a defend into your deck for, in my opinion, at least in most cases. Obviously, there are cases where you want to do that. Silent 1 is, in fact, one of those cases. We had that exact scenario in one of our episodes, and we got the recover draw timed exactly right, I think 2 or 3 times to get the antidote back and remove the poison on the Bane turn, which was insanely good luck. So that was cool. There's also, I guess, the argument that you can build into dexterity, permanent dexterity scaling. However, as I'll discuss later, that doesn't really happen enough to me to want to take that, to want to lean into that. And honestly, if you want to lean into a dexterity scaling build, I think wards are the better bet. Alright, up next, Reroute. B tier. As I was saying before, I think I evaluated these 2 cards wrong in an episode, and I think Reroute is better. Does 1 more damage. I've had bad experiences with this card. I once had a deck that relied on stasis the similar way that Planning does. I had multiple reroutes putting things into stasis, and I lost that run because apparently paying 1 energy for that ability is very slow. That being said, I think I'm starting to come around to this card. It does 9 damage instead of 8, which I think is an acceptable level for a 1 cost. And although putting the next card you play into stasis is not always going to be a great thing, you can time what else you want to play. So like if you know what's going to happen in 2 turns, which is actually quite frequent for me, playing the game as much as I have. If you know what the enemy's going to do in 2 turns, or you know what or you have an idea of what you're going to draw in 2 turns, you can pick a card that will fit that that bill to go into stasis. There's also the case of like wanting to put certain cards into stasis that like it. However, I think that sort of fails to do that well. A lot of cards that want to go into stasis already put themselves into stasis. Shield Charger doesn't do anything with reroute. It already puts itself into stasis for 2 energy. You're not going to get extra stasis out of it. You can't put Orb Walk into stasis because it's a power and will play immediately. What else? Charge Up is another one. There's Fierce Bash, which is already going in. Yeah, there's just all sort, and you can't put anything that exhausts into stasis too. It has so many requirements for it to be good that most of the time you're just getting a little bit of benefit out of it. Really, the only thing that I feel like this does well is with specific card combinations for a deck that already wants to do something else, such as having a Body Slam. If you have a Body Slam deck and you draw it in the same hand as Reroute, you want to be able to play that Body Slam again in a couple turns, most of the time. So getting that back in, Reroute will enable other builds rather than being a good enabler by itself. So it still has utility in that way. I was going to say something else here too. Oh yeah, the 9 damage I think is also a good enough consideration to put it into B tier. I think as a starter, as an early game card, it's good enough value, especially if you're on 3 energy. That extra stasis will come in very handy. And of course, you need attacks, right? This is another reason why this is above Recover, even though it does what Recover does, but worse, right? maybe a little bit more nuanced than that, but Recover can usually get more cards than Reroute. Oh yeah, Recover, if you play the other card first, then Recover, then you can put it into stasis anyway, even though it was in your hand, because it goes from your hand to discard. So yeah, even though Reroute does it a little bit worse, I think the fact that it is a 9 damage attack is good enough to put it into B tier by a little bit. I would actually like to see this card override the requirements of powers and exhaust cards. I think that would be really cool. Maybe that's I can see people disagreeing with that though, especially the devs. We'd have to see. I just think it would be really cool interaction and make the card a lot better at what it's trying to do. Alright, up next is Roll Attack. Roll Attack, 2 energy, deal 16 damage if in defensive mode affects all enemies. Otherwise, brace 8, and it has a socket. It's a lot of lines of text for a common. But hey, this is another card that I have had to warm up to. Although I've warmed up to it very early on in my Guardian career. 16 damage for 2 energy does not seem very impressive at its surface. It affecting all enemies is what seems a lot more alluring, but after you try it a few times, you realize that's probably not going to happen. Most of the time, you're just going to get that brace 8. That being said, Guardian does not have a lot of big damage options in its commons, and also it has the same quality as Silent, that it has no additional damage built into its starting deck. Ironclad has Bash, Defect has Zap, Dual Cast, and its starting relic, and Watcher has Wrath with Eruption. Silent, however, has only Survivor and Neutralize, which don't increase her damage at all. Similarly, I guess you could make the argument that if you get either of the damaging starting gems, such as the Ruby, which gives Strength, or the Tourmaline, which gives Thorns, then you have the extra starting damage. But in your actual starting deck, your 2 special cards are Curl Up and Twin Slam, which does less than a strike at base. I don't think those are comparable to Vulnerable, Wrath, or the Orbs. I think those are a lot less powerful. So having a 16 damage option is not too low to think about, right? Especially with the other damage options available. You don't really have a better way to deal damage. That being said, even though it's technically 8 damage for 1 energy, I've come around a lot to the idea that cards that cost more but have that level of efficiency are actually still very good, and I think this is actually better than Priming Shot, even without the brace or defensive mode text on either of them. If it was just 8 damage for 1 energy or 16 damage for 2 energy, I would take the 2 energy 16 damage because it's efficient. It costs 1 card draw. You are actually getting 2 of these stapled together. You are getting 2 of those extra 2 damages, extra 2 being over the strike, on the same card, even though you have to pay 2 for it. The efficiency itself does not matter, as the efficiency of energy to damage is only part of the equation. You were getting twice as much of that, and you were only drawing 1 card worth of, you were only using 1 card draw. So the efficiency is much, much higher. Also, I have learned that the Brace 8 is really, really powerful. Brace 8 is the highest you can get on any card, unless you put a bunch of Sapphires into your Bauble Burst for some reason. Then you can't even hit defensive with 1 Bauble Burst and 2 Sapphires. That really sucks. I know that card is getting reworked somewhat soon, but that really puts into perspective how terrible this thing is. So, yeah, this, I believe, belongs in B tier with Reroute. It's not an A tier card. I think the 2 cost combat attack is still somewhat of a weakness later in the game. It will fall off, I think. But it's still a lot. In my experience, it's still been very, very good. Up next, Shield Charger. Shield Charger, I have it at A tier. I'm wondering if it belongs in S. I'll just put this in here for now. A tier. This thing is another card that its main downside is you pay 2 energy and it does nothing the turn you play it. However, the next 3 turns you were getting benefit on all of them. You were getting 10 block per turn, which is the same as going into defensive mode, by the way. That's basically a defensive mode card on your next 3 turns, and you were bracing for 4. So not only will you be getting that extra 10 block every turn for 3 turns, you will more easily be able to go into defensive on one of those turns, and you have control over when that happens. A lot more, anyways. So you can even keep some of that block if you don't need it, which would, I guess, be a normal downside of the card. You're not going to need to block every turn in every fight. Even though I wasn't particularly fond of this card when I first started out as Guardian. Although when I first started out as Guardian, I was also giving an energy every turn, which is apparently super busted. But coming back to it later, when it doesn't have the energy anymore, I had to take it a few times, and I was very wary about the 2 cost it not doing anything the turn you play it. But over time, my experience has been very, very positive with this card. Its weakness is obvious, but what it does later in the fight is not always. In the late game, this is definitely an S tier card. In the early game, I would take it if I wasn't offered a better option, like a damage option, or if I knew that I needed to block a lot. Also, it's not great against the Act 1 bosses. I think this will stay in A tier for that reason. It's not a great early game card. Going into Act 2 and Act 3, yes, even Act 2, it's a very, very strong card. Because not only will it put itself into stasis, but maybe by that time you will have other ways to enable it, such as maybe with a suspension if you're lucky. It's not usually a card I take, or with a planning if you get it the right draw order, or if you have future plans. Future plans, putting a 2-cost card into stasis for free is huge value. Or you could do recover if you have that in your deck somehow. There's a lot of ways to enable this. Pre-program is actually maybe even the best one. The one that can look into your draw pile and put a card of your choice into stasis. Also, it can work with Accelerate. I usually shy away from that because I like the spread out block over turns. You usually don't need to get a bunch of block at once when you're getting 10 every turn. Sometimes you will, but sometimes you won't. The nice thing is that, of course, if you have Accelerate, you can get 10 of that block immediately after playing it. This would actually be a nice combo with Incinerate, I guess, because you don't need the card to come out. You need the card to stay in stasis and give you the benefits there. So you get those 2 cards in hand, you play the Shield Charger, you play the Incinerate, bam. 7 energy, 10 damage. Good enough turn to set up for your future. Won't have to worry about block for the next couple turns. So yeah, A tier card for me. Suspension. I have this in C tier as well. Suspension is weird. It's kind of like planning's cousin. It places a card from your hand into stasis rather than the top two cards of your draw pile. It's more controlled, so why does it in C tier while planning's in A? Well, the problem is that it takes up two of your draws in order to be effective. And by two of your draws, I mean two of the cards in your hand. You are playing the suspension, you drew the suspension, you have 4 cards left in your hand. You place a card of your choice into stasis, you now have 3 cards in your hand. So not only are you having to choose, not only would you want to choose a card that you want a couple turns later, but you also are taking that card away from your turn immediately. It's so much setup for, it's a very hefty setup cost for very little payoff most of the time. I guess this would count as an energy card in certain cases. If you have cards like Orb Walk or Shield Charger that like to be put into stasis, then drawing that with suspension can be a way to save energy, because then you don't have to play them to get in their benefit. It also has a socket, just like planning, so it's the same footing with that. Another reason why this is bad is because you are then left with 3 energy if you don't have an energy relic in the early game to play 3 cards, which, if you've been sort of catching on, is not consistent at all. You could draw Sender's Bane. You could draw cards that you want to play, and then the last card that you put into stasis, you don't really care about being in stasis. You could get 3 bad cards. You could get other bad cards other than a Sender's Bane. Also, if you have an energy relic, it's even worse, because now you have 3 cards with 4 energy, and now you just wasted your energy. It's kind of like Concentrate in its downside, where you're spending all these cards to gain a benefit for the remaining ones, and you just can't use it unless you have like an X cost. At least early in the game. Obviously, I said later in the game that Concentrate's very good, but early in the game, and of course this being a common, you're going to see a lot of those. It's not great. The one caveat I have to mention here is that it upgrades to draw a card. It upgrades to become a cantrip, which, if you have watched Tricky, or anyone who prioritizes finding infinites or small decking, you will know that this can be very problematic. This is a common card that draws 1 for 0 energy. It can become very problematic in terms of balance if you find 2 of these and upgrade them, and then just put stuff into their sockets. All you have to do is put a couple of ward gems into the sockets, and then suddenly you have infinite block. And then with the rest of your at least 3 energy, you can even just have 3 energy deck with this. You can just you can just block infinitely and then play the rest of your cards for damage. You may need a little bit more support than that, but it shouldn't be too hard to find if you're just using commons. It's very easy. I see this being very easy to high roll into. The reason it's in C is because I don't play like that. If you do play like that, your evaluation is probably somewhere in the A range, maybe even S range, for that reason. The only reason I would say it might be an A range for that is because of all the extra support it needs. You need to be able to thin your deck down fast enough. You need to be able, or you need to be able to use stasis. Also, you need the damage in some other way. You need the right gems. It requires a lot of support. But yeah, the biggest thing about it is that you don't have to put a card into stasis if you don't want to. So if you can just play that infinitely. It doesn't require the stasis slot to be open. It doesn't require you to put a card into stasis. You can just hit confirm and nothing goes in. So yeah, Infinite Maker, not my cup of tea, so it's going to stay in C tier. Maybe you think that's weird. I think it's accurate, because like, what you're going to see in this series is not me using that for infinites. You're going to see me using it in times where, like, I actually want to put a card into stasis. The upgrade is just like a way to mitigate it. I think that does need to be changed, though, to remove that problematic aspect. You can't. We're learning very quickly in the modded community that you cannot have cantrips in the common pool. At least cantrips that don't exhaust. Alright, up next, Temporal Shield. I have this in B tier. It feels more like a C tier card to me because it blocks. I guess I was feeling generous when I made the tier list. There's probably a couple reasons for that. One is that it's a little bit weaker than a Shrug It Off, uh, in that it requires stasis in order to be effective. Again, it would be a Defend Plus, uh, which can be nice. I don't really want to spend 1 energy on 8 block by itself if I whiff on the stasis, especially since your only starting stasis is Curl Up, and you don't always want to build into it. So it's a little bit inconsistent. But that being said, when it's there, you do have basically a Shrug It Off, which is an okay card. Definitely okay early. Stays relevant later in the game, which is a plus. Also, its upgrades to 10 block and drawing 2 cards. I think this is what influenced me to put it into B tier. In my experience, it's been a C tier card because I haven't taken it much. I feel like that maybe that's just because of my pick rate, though. It's not because it hasn't felt strong, it's just because I haven't been taking it. So I think in this case, my mind takes precedence over my experience, and I'm going to put it into B. Maybe I'll start taking it a little bit more often later in the series. Maybe I'll take it and upgrade it so that it blocks twice. It draws twice. Could be a good card to take into Act 2 as a block card, like I said. The fact that it draws cards means that it will stay relevant the whole game, even though it doesn't have the highest block numbers. I don't know if I really mentioned this too much, but like another big reason that like the block cards aren't great, other than the numbers being around like Defend Plus or less, is just that you have another way to get defense in this, and that's with Brace and defensive mode. So you don't need block cards as much. I'm a little bit weirded out. No, that's too strong. I'm unsure why these cards have the values that they do. I guess like they exist just because they can. Like putting block cards into a pool is kind of obvious. It does seem like they need to have another look at them though, because most of the time I'm not going to be taking or needing common block cards. This is just here out of, I guess, charity. We'll see if that actually is correct coming up. I have a feeling it will be. I'll just have to take a bit closer look at it in the future. Alright, Temporal Strike. Another C tier. It is deal 7 damage, gain 1 energy if you have a card in stasis. Counterpart to Temporal Shield gives you an energy instead of a card draw. It's essentially a 0-cost card if you have the stasis support. Again, it has that downside. So if it's inconsistent, then it's not even giving you as much benefit as Temporal Shield. This is why this is in C tier. If you miss on the stasis, 8 block is a lot better than 7 damage. In most cases. Obviously, comparing block to damage is not usually the case, but in the early game you can usually have some semblance of a comparison point. Strikes do more than defense for a reason, right? 6 damage, 5 block. Reversing it means that Temporal Strike is doing a lot less than when it whiffs. 8 block is a lot more acceptable. Gaining an energy when a card is in stasis can be good. When you don't boss swap or you boss swap into a non-energy relic, having this be able to refund your energy as a 0-cost attack card can be very strong. I've used it a few times. It's definitely usable. I've gone infinite with it once, and either a clone or either the clone card or another Temporal Strike, and having quartz in it, because it will refund the cost and then draw a card, and then you basically have a cantrip that does damage. So yeah, it can be very useful. Like everything in C tier has use, even if it's not too often. They just require more support, I think. D tier is of course very situationally usable, and then F tier is like almost completely unusable. Similarly, I want to just say that B tier, like usually B tier is like in the middle, like We don't usually have all 6. Sometimes there's just 5, and then B tier just kind of feels like, eh, B tier's bad. But here it's actually, I think this is a good tier. Like, I would take these cards if they were offered to me in the early game, right? So I don't think they belong, I don't think that B tier should be considered bad, even if people are inclined to think that. Maybe that's just me, though. Up next is Vent Steam. Vent Steam is an A tier card. This is one I've actually been wanting to talk about a lot, and after thinking about it for a while, I've realized something very interesting. When I first started this character, like seeing this 1 energy 2 vulnerable, is like I don't know how to evaluate this, right? It's like Ironclad has so many sources of vulnerable, and then this is just like the oversimplified version of all of them. Like all of them have something else attached that makes it a lot easier to evaluate than this. 50% extra damage. What does that actually mean to me? I didn't know. Now I do. Two vulnerable for 1 energy is broken. This card by itself is so strong in the early game, and stays relevant all game. And I think the best way to make this point is actually to compare to Ironclad. I know that you can't always make a direct comparison to other characters because of the context of their other cards. But here, there is not a single Ironclad card that applies 2 or more vulnerable for 1 energy. You have Bash, which is 2 vulnerable for 2 energy. You have Thunderclap, which is 1 vulnerable for 1 energy. You have Uppercut, which is 1 or 2 vulnerable for 2 energy. And you have Shockwave, which is 3 vulnerable to 5 vulnerable for 2 energy. Now, this may seem proportionate because it has nothing else attached, but it's not. You get so much value out of this vulnerable in all stages of the game. And at 1 energy, the cost of getting that 50% bonus damage is so low. Not only are you safer on the turn that you play it, which is probably why all those 2 vulnerable cards, those 2+ vulnerable cards have a 2 cost attached. Not only are you safe the turn you play it, but you still can benefit from it the next turn if you can't afford to attack this turn. Like, having 2 vulnerable is like a baseline for vulnerable to be useful. That's why Thunderclap is bad. That's why Garnet is situationally useful. Because you don't always draw the cards that you need on the turn. But having multiple turns to do it so that you don't require this combo of cards to show up on the same hand makes it much better. Also, the fact that it has 2 sockets, why? It makes it so good. You've just enabled this card, which is already a very strong enabler, to have very strong gem combos. One of which is Dex and Ward, which are both commons. It's not exactly the greatest thing to put into Event Steam, but if you need the safety, you suddenly have it. Even just 2 wards can be okay. 2 strength gems can be absurdly powerful, because you are essentially gaining 6 strength instead of 4 because the vulnerable multiplies the bonus damage by 1.5. You can make it a very powerful combo tool, and while I said that you don't need to make it that way, having that available as an option means that you can maybe even end a fight the turn that you draw it. You draw that with a, let's say a Walker Claw Plus, that's 9 damage times 4, and then vulnerable makes it 13 times 4, 52 damage for 3 energy. And those are all commons in the early game. You could get that combo in the early game. So yeah, I think that card like needs a nerf somehow. But that being said, like, how do you do that? If you do apply 1 vulnerable, it like almost becomes unusable, I think, unless you make it cost 0 or something. But then you just have another Garnet. I don't know how you would change that to make it better. You could make it maybe closer to the Vent Steam that Guardian already has, maybe a 2 energy for 2 vulnerable, 2 weaken. That also seems just like a that just seems like a Shockwave copy. Also, weaken is really strong on Guardian because of all the block it generates. So yeah, I don't know what you would do with that card to change it. I do think it's too strong though. Uh, it's like it turns your weak starting deck into one that can beat any elite. Uh, except for maybe sentries, but sentries you usually need like a special card for anyways, in order to not take a lot of damage. So yeah, I'm hoping to see that card changed at some point, but also kind of not because I like it. I like feeling powerful from it, but you know, that's just how it's gonna go. All right, up next is Walker Claw. Walker Claw, I had to think about this one for a while, but I think that it also ends up in C tier, surprisingly. It's 2 energy, deal 15 damage. If you have the red key, which you're going to at some point, then it will be 2 energy, 18 damage. It's respectable, and of course there are a lot of sources of strength that you can build into, but it has a couple problems. One, it doesn't do anything else by itself. So it absolutely needs strength in order to do anything. It's basically the equivalent of Heavy Blade on Ironclad. Heavy Blade is obviously, I think, a lot worse on Ironclad because he has a lot better. He has a lot of other sources to dump strength. Guardian doesn't have as many. It still has a decent number, but I think this still kind of works. Also, the fact that like you can also get 4 energy sometimes with the boss swap, I think helps it a lot. But usually, I'm not like it's very polarizing. Like when you have strength, it's very good. When you don't have strength, it's bad. I've taken it on 3 energy in a non-strength deck before, looking to build into strength, and then I just didn't find any, or didn't want to take any because it wasn't that great. Like if I took an orb walk with it, it would require me to draw the orb walk before the Walker Claw, and it would require me to spend 4 energy on 21 damage total. I guess it's a little bit less than. I guess it would be like 3 energy on 21 damage. It still seems very low. Like the cost to actually use it is very difficult to justify. I mean, the times that I take Walker Claw, it feels good. Like in the late game, most of the time it's very relevant. It's a very tough call for me to put it into B or C tier. I think it does belong in C. Maybe that'll change over time. I could definitely see it being B. It kind of feels bad no matter which one I put it in. But yeah, the fact is that it's also 2 energy for a 3 times damage dump, 3 times strength dump. I mean, and it upgrades. So you really need to upgrade it in order for it to be at its best at 4 times. But yeah, this doesn't. This would be one of the cards that I would feel like I could learn about over time. I feel like it does belong. I feel like it could belong in B or C. Especially because like Walker Claw comes up so many times later in the game, and then I'm like, oh, I need a multi-attack card, and then I end up taking it. Maybe I'm thinking a little bit too much in the common card direction here. Where like if I'm thinking about commons, I'm thinking about taking them in the early game. That being said, I think I am going to keep it in C tier. Like I said, it hurts to do so, but I think it's a very important thing to think about the fact that you can only take it when you have support for it. So you know, but every card can do that, right? Every card can be good once you have support for it. Walker Claw gets that support a little bit more often, but you can't take it in the early game unless you already have that support. It becomes relevant later, quite often, but it's also competing against other multi-attacks too. So I'm going to just keep it in C. Alright, now we're on to the interesting stuff, the gems. The gems are going to be very... now that we have like a baseline for a lot of these things, we don't need to worry about them being too abstract. Because a lot of our sockets are now here. A lot of common cards have sockets. we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, no, 8, 9. 9 common cards with sockets out of, what is that, 15? Wow, that's actually 60%. So that's most of them. It's cool. So yeah, starting with this. Aquamarine is an A tier. Now, 3 block is not very much, but the fact that this card handles a very specific problem that it makes it an A tier. It may not be very strong by itself, but a lot of these common attacks have a socket, and it means that when you draw them, especially in the late game, later in the game you get, the less relevant that these common attacks are going to be. They will have an ability attached to them that make them sort of good, but the damage is going to be a lot less relevant, and the cost is probably not going to be as efficient. So if you draw these on the wrong turns when the enemy is attacking, especially something in like Act 2, and you need extra block, and you draw these cards, you're going to be a lot more vulnerable to taking damage. Aquamarine solves this problem. Also, you get green key, so you get a little bit extra dex. Sometimes you can build into the dex with the Aquamarine. The fact that this can be socketed into pretty much any card and solve issues makes it A tier. I can't think of a single card where I wouldn't want this. The worst I can think of is like Piercing Hide, but even then, like, you know, more block, you're not going to complain. So yeah, having safety available to you in a common card form is really powerful. I saw some other people put this in S rank. The reason that I'm not putting it in S rank is because you need a lot of them, or very specific combos. It still has a requirement for it to be strong. It's to be like overwhelmingly strong. So it stays in A tier, in my opinion. On to the next stuff here. Tourmaline, the Thorns gem, is going to go in B tier. It's a little bit strange. I don't find myself taking this gem very often, but a lot of this evaluation is coming from my recent experience in these 10 episodes, actually, from putting it into Twin Slam. We didn't get it very often, but the times that we did get it, it made me realize that when it's socketed in Twin Slam, it does a lot of early game damage. That early game damage comes from Twin Slam, making it 8 Thorns, and even though something attacks once, it's an extra 8 damage. So you essentially have a either a 1 cost 11 damage or a 2 cost 22 damage. And sometimes you get even more benefit out of it. Like, it's not consistent, but you can get more benefit out of it in multi-enemy fights, especially in Act 1. Something like the Gremlins or the Slime Gang, even just a 2-enemy fight can still be useful. This is done work against Jawworm as well, where you need to block, where you need to kill it quickly enough before it starts scaling up. Like 8 damage against that fight, if you get a bad draw, is a lot of compensation. Also, the fact that if you put it in Twin Slam, you get a lot of burst, and if you can control when the Twin Slam comes in, you can get a lot of Thorns damage for very little cost. That being said, it's not a great card to use for scaling. It's very difficult to keep all those Thorns in as a reasonable number. Debuff reduction usually only comes 1 at a time. Sometimes it's 2 from Resilient Plate, but most of the time it's only once. From Ancient Power, Overload, Ancient Power Plus, Overload Plus, and Onyx. So you only keep 1 Thorns at a time most of the time, and that's it's not very much. There's a reason why this gives 4 Thorns up front. So it's not great for scaling. That being said, I have put it into Piercing Hide as well. The fact that it can go into Twin Slam is good. And if you're going into if you have a very defensive deck that doesn't really have a way to do damage well, then Thorns can be your way out of that. If you find more Thorns, you can socket them into other cards as a way to deal damage. There's not very many other Thorns options. I think there's literally only Piercing Hide and what's that other card? Harden, and that one has a requirement. So yeah, that may change in the future, but I think that this edges its way into B tier. I know a lot of people won't agree with this. I think a lot of them think it's like C or D tier. Because it's hard to keep Thorns, it's very hard to make it an effective build. But I think that the times where you want it to be good, it will be good, and the times where you're forced to take it, it's still very good, like in the at the beginning of the game. All right, up next is going to be another very interesting choice. I'm putting Emerald into C tier. Now, Emerald, I will say, is the card that benefits the most from debuff reduction. Temporary Dexterity, 2 Temporary Dexterity is a lot stronger than 2 Temporary Strength going into the late game. If you can keep the Dexterity, you don't need to block as much as you need to do damage, right? When you have an incoming attack, you're getting attacked for like 50 in the late game, right? But you're doing so much more damage every turn. Like in the very late game, you're doing like 60 a turn, maybe even 70. So like, you would need a lot more strength than you need Dex in order to win a fight. Dex, there's an upper limit. There's pretty much an upper limit to how much you can get attacked for, but there's not really an upper limit for how much you can attack for. So this does a lot for its thing if you can reduce the debuffs. However, what it does also require are block cards, and as I've discussed before, block cards are usually not it can be not an integral part of Guardian's defensive plan. It has an alternative in its defensive mode. So sometimes you actually want to cut block cards from your deck rather than add more. So an Emerald can end up being especially bad in those cases. Also, unsocketed Emerald is extremely reliant on the other cards you draw. And most of the time, you're not going to have as many block cards as other cards in your deck. That's just a general fact of how the game plays out. There's a lot more attacks, like maybe even if the number of attacks and skills in a card pool is the same, most of the skills are not going to be block cards. So you're going to be a lot more likely to get attacks. You're also likely to get powers. You're also likely to get skills that don't block. So you would need sort of a specific build in order to take Emerald. You need a build that somehow still has block cards, which is definitely very possible with Aquamarine, if you choose to build it that way. And you need to not be doing a lot of brace stuff. Otherwise, you would probably not need this other extra defense. So if you draw this unsocketed in a hand, you're kind of sad. It's not a great setup card. In fact, this would be a card that I don't really want to put in planning or suspension like that. Like I would actually want to put rubies in these, which I will talk about in a sec, but not Emerald. So yeah, when Emerald is good, it's very good. Like it's very good in Twin Slam with an Aquamarine. It also can be good in Vent Steam, sometimes in the other multi-socketed cards, but I find that the occasion where I actually want that is rarer than when I want a Tourmaline, which may be strange to you, but that's where I'm at. Also, like, if you're going into a debuff reduction strategy with Dexterity, you only need a little bit of Dex to be good. So most of the time, you're only going to need like 2 of these at maximum. You're only going to need 2 Emeralds at maximum. Meanwhile, you can take like a bunch of Aquamarines and be fine with it. So once you have your 2 and then you just keep getting offered Emeralds, like, you don't need any more. Like, why would you want them? Let's see. So yeah, that's my reasoning for it being in C. I can definitely, absolutely see people disagreeing with this. On to Ruby. I'm putting it above Emerald. Another possibly controversial opinion. But I find this to be more useful in more cases. Maybe just because of Act 1. I talk a lot about Act 1, probably because there's a lot of common cards here, but, you know, Act 1 is probably Guardian's most important act. You need to survive in a bad way. And the way to survive is by doing damage and using your defensive mode. At least most of the time. Actually, the vast majority of the time. I can't think of a time where you wouldn't use those two things. Ruby is a very great gem to get early. Pairs well with the attacks that you want to take. I wouldn't put it in Twin Slam at the time of this recording. I actually changed my opinion on that because of like the math on how that works with Twin Slam. If you put a Ruby in Twin Slam versus keeping it out, you get roughly the same damage. Also, if you want the full benefit from a double Ruby, you have to spend 2 energy on it, which can be bad. Meanwhile, keeping it unsocketed can maybe give you more benefit in general, especially if you don't want to spend 2 energy to get your strength. You can just spend 0 to get 2. I'd say that's maybe around the same efficiency, but it has more flexibility. It goes well with Vent Steam. It goes well in planning and suspension. Like I said, usually you have multiple ways to block with like defensive mode or something. If you're already somewhat... So it can be pretty easy to be set on your defense after just taking a few enabler cards. Like a shield charger could just be enough. What you really need to focus on is your damage a lot. Ruby helps a lot with that. So if you put those into your enabler cards such as planning or suspension, you can get a good damage combo on the turn that you do it, on the turn that you draw them with your other cards. Also, it's generally very good to reduce debuffs like that. It pairs very well with Vent Steam as well. Like, it has very specific combinations, but those combinations are pretty good. And it helps a lot with something that Guardian can sometimes struggle with, damage specifically. Let's see. What else do I want to say about this? I guess it belongs here with Tourmaline simply because, like, as a gem, it doesn't do that much. Like, it can help. It may need some support to do so. When I'm willing to take a gem, I probably will want it about as much as Tourmaline, depending on the build, I mean. Because, like, they both do the same thing in different ways, right? They give you more damage. I guess that being said, I wouldn't really want to take these as often as I take these cards. Gems are in kind of a weird state. I do feel like these are correct for gems specifically. They're kind of in their own little world. But, like, I guess realistically these 3 should be down a tier if I want to compare them to cards. Because they're so situationally useful. They need sockets to be good. Do I do that then? Do I move them all down a... You know what, that actually seems reasonable. I'm keeping Aquamarine at A because it's just so good. But I think this is more realistic. I could see myself wanting a Tourmaline as much as I want these other cards. Same with Ruby. I can't see myself wanting them as much as I want these. That's with my own playstyle, though. I know some people really like leaning into gems and all the buffs that they can give. So sometimes that strategy can work out very well. I'm gonna grab some water again. Alright. Now we get into the uncommons. I feel like this is taking a long time. How many cards have we even gone through at this point? We've gone through 18? 19? 19 cards. Alright, we'll see how fast we can get through the rest of these. Ancient Power. I have that in B tier. And I think I'm going to agree with that. I get this here. Thank you. Alright. 4 temporary strength, 4 temporary dex. Very flexible because it gives both offense and defense enabling. 1 energy for all those temporary buffs. I'm willing to pay that, absolutely. Yeah, very decent early game card, honestly. If I'm not offered a better option, I will take it. Um, and of course, the upgrade reducing debuffs by 1 means that it keeps 1 permanent strength index, which is surprisingly good in fights. Giving a small benefit to both offense and defense can make a difference. It's not like flashy, it's not like super strong, it's just kind of a generic buff. I still think it's worth doing. So yeah, I don't really have too much to say about that. I just feel like it belongs in B tier. Maybe I'll even consider taking that over some of these common attacks in the future. Alright, you know what? I'm going to get these 3 uncommon protocols out of the way. All 3 of them are C tier. There's Evasive, and where's Spiker? There it is. Armored Protocol, Evasive Protocol, Spiker Protocol. Basically what these cards say to me is at the start of your turn, brace 3. At least most of the time. The additional benefits have their uses, but first I want to go over this brace 3. It's a very low brace amount, but that being said, we did just have an episode, episode 10, where our brace was our block system, at least for scaling. We had a lot of upfront block options already available to us, passively and with a panic button actively. So using this brace in order to go into defensive on turns that we needed it, as well as doing it consistently, was very helpful to us. I used Armored Protocol especially to make sure that we had extra burst block, because most of our block was from Protocol, or because most of our scaling block was from Protocol. The extra block at the end of turn was actually kind of useful. So that would be the use of that one. Evasive Protocol, I've used this specifically before for the Niao fight, with the big Divinity turn, with or without Ironclad. Going into defensive on that turn and being able to use block cards to block a big burst turn is a valid use of Evasive Protocol. That being said, okay, well, I'll move on to this first. Spiker Protocol, more damage, very interesting, especially pairs especially well with defensive mode, because if you're blocking, you're probably taking damage, and if you're taking damage, you're probably being attacked. So having a protocol that does damage back when you already have your block is a very good benefit. By the way, I'm not really ordering these inside this. I think they're all roughly fine to rank within this, and ranking each individually within the line would be so much hassle. This would probably be the best one though, followed by this and then this. The benefits are they were very tempting to me when I first started playing Guardian. I think I took these a few times. But then eventually I realized that you're not going into defensive very often with these cards. You need more defensive support. And if you have more defensive support, the counterpart is that these are only bracing 3 per turn, which is actually kind of slow. Obviously Guardian is slow, but I don't think it's that slow. I might consider these more heavily if they brace for 4, but bracing for 3 is really not that much. For the same reason we talked about with Priming Shot, and then of course that applies to the other 2 cards that brace for 3. They just don't do enough. And of course, these buffs happening on sparse turns, where you can't always control it. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, and sometimes you don't even need the benefit that turn. So gaining them only for 1 turn is not great. I guess I'll do this now. I'll do it later. Alright, up next is Body Slam. Body Slam goes in S tier. If you've been watching this series so far, you may be surprised by that. We haven't taken Body Slam that much. But here's the explanation. 1, we haven't yet really seen just how crazy the block can get on Guardian. We've seen a bit. We've seen some numbers hit up to 90 or maybe even 100 a couple times. But we haven't really had a situation where we needed the Body Slam as damage. Additionally, you're not always going... Well, here's the thing. Guardian almost always gets really absurd block numbers. So Body Slam, if you need the damage, can be very good in pretty much all situations. Like, I would take a floor 1 Body Slam. It's so easy to build into. That being said, even though it won't always be good, just like in this series, I think we've taken it once, maybe twice. Even though it won't always be good, it will still be good in the times that you need it, almost always. If you don't need to take a card, don't take it, right? If I have a damage system already that's working perfectly fine, I'm not going to take Body Slam. It's S tier anyways, not because you can always take it, but because you can always take it when you need it. Just because Guardian's block numbers are so absurd. So that's why this is S tier. I'm glad that this is not common, like on Ironclad. Being able to... having this much block is just crazy. Also, someone else brought up the fact that since Guardian has Stasis, bringing Body Slam back into Stasis and being able to replay it so fast is is another very strong part of the card, especially because it still upgrades to be 0 cost. Yeah, it's very strong. Oh, by the way, I wanted to bring this up. These protocols only, when you upgrade them, they only upgrade their benefit. You don't upgrade the brace per turn. Very strange decision, in my opinion. Like I can see them maybe keeping them on brace 3 per turn as the original if they upgraded to brace 4. Like, I feel like it would be reasonable. Maybe even 5. But otherwise, they just upgrade this. This gets 5 block per turn at the end of each turn. If you're in defensive, it upgrades to 8. This upgrades from 3 dexterity to 5, and this upgrades from 4 thorns to 6. It's kind of... They're not good upgrades. Alright, up next is Charge Up. Where do I have that? I can't find it. Okay, found it. It's in C tier. Charge Up is in C tier. It's 2 tiers below Shield Charger, even though it does something similar. It gives you block next turn and 1 strength. Now, those things are very useful, right? But only having a benefit for 1 turn, and combined with the fact that you're not getting the benefit this turn, is bad for the card. Even though it's somehow uncommon and Shield Charger is common. Honestly, those 2 things should be switched in rarity. It would make a lot more sense. Shield Charger is just so good in the mid to late game, you can't ignore it. Meanwhile, Charge Up definitely feels a lot more like a common. It's getting a buff soon. Instead of increasing the cost when it's upgraded, it'll just go into stasis for 2 turns. So yeah. But this doesn't do... most often it doesn't do enough. The only reason it's in C and not D is because sometimes the strength is necessary to beat the Act 1 boss. Yeah, otherwise it's not great. It just has a good situation when you need it. Scaling will do that to you. Alright, up next is Clone. I used to think that this was great, and it kind of hurts to do this, but I'm putting it in D. It's a card, again, that doesn't have any benefit the turn you play it. You're going to have to wait for whatever card you copy to put into stasis to come out. Also, you have to draw it on a turn with a good card. Also, you have to have a good card. All of these are requirements that I felt like have really hurt this card. In the past, I felt like Clone was super powerful because, you know, usually copying a very strong card is a fight-winning maneuver. If you're able to double a card, that's usually very, very breakable. You either already have the synergies available for that card to be good, or you can stack it with the other card for even additional benefits, or sometimes both. Nothing really comes to mind, but I'm sure that can happen. That's why I initially evaluated this card as very, very high, because the ceiling was so high that maybe the cost was not that big of a deal. Turns out it is. The upgrade is cool. It accelerates once. It's very situationally useful when upgraded because not only will you get your not only will you get can you get your copied card out one turn sooner, which is not perfect, but it can be good. You can also use it on other cards that are in stasis to accelerate them out immediately, or on something like Shield Charger to get immediate 10 block. So it's okay. I don't think it belongs in F tier, simply because it has that power ceiling, and it has that little bit of extra utility from upgrading. But it's not that powerful. Alright, up next, how much do we have left to go? Alright, up next is Emergency. I have Emergency in C tier as well as Charge Up. Okay. Emergency is a very situational card. Being able to get a card immediately out of stasis into your hand is nice sometimes, but that depends on a few things. One, it's really only strong if the card you're bringing out is not like a strike or defend, and that happens quite often. If you want to get them out of your hand, you're just using stasis generically and not with intense purpose. Two, you need to not have your first card in stasis be in there for one more turn, and that happens quite often. If you draw this on the wrong turn, it accelerates once, and then you've used a card to what? Accelerate once? That's pretty much the same as an Amber, except it exhausts. And I've played with unsocketed Ambers before because, I want to socket them. This isn't the greatest thing. Definitely like it socketed. Definitely need this to be on the right turn. So you could put it into stasis, which means it would take a stasis slot too. Or you need the right cards for it, which is actually kind of difficult. The best combo it has is with Fierce Bash, because it goes into stasis for 4. Sometimes if you use planning and put the wrong thing into stasis, because of the luck involved, it can be good to get your construction form out. But even then, it's still luck based because you got to get the first card and not the second. You have to have nothing else in stasis already. It has a lot of requirements. That being said, it's still very powerful. It still can be powerful with the right support or the right timing. So yeah, it's in C tier, not anything lower. Alright, up next. Floating Orbs. This is a card that I know that people value very, very highly. Because Guardian has a lot of ways to gain strength. And it multiplies that by 2. It's better than Infinite Blades. Simply because it hits twice, even though it does the same base damage. And that can get broken very, very quickly. It can even be your entire offense system if you want it to be. Or at least most of it. Oftentimes it ends up being most of it. I wasn't sure which one to put this in. On my guide I have it at S tier. I'm not 100% sold on that. The problem is, of course, is that you're not always going to be doing strength. You can speculate on it early, and it's good damage for the early game. Also, you have the red key at least. So I think it stays relevant. It just, if you want to take it, you want it to be a damage engine and not just an incident. A big problem that this card can run into is Meow. There is a 3 in 5 chance of having the silent bonus, Thorns. And that's a big downside for this card because the only way that Orb Slam exhausts is if you play it. So in order to get rid of it, you have to spend block or HP on the Thorns. And if you don't have a lot of strength to dump, then that can end up being a huge downside. So you might just end up having a curse in the deck. I really do struggle with whether or not this card belongs in A or S tier. let's think about this for a second. Our strength sources are our strength gem. We also have vent steam for a little bit extra damage. You have construction form. Sometimes you have revenge protocol. If you're getting these orb slams every turn, then revenge protocol is actually relevant. You also have ancient power. You have orb walk. So you can pretty consistently get strength in your run. And then there's a couple of other things that that can give you strength indirectly. I feel like you do need to build a lot into strength in order to get the full benefit from this. Or you need to have a lot of other attack cards. Yeah, I don't think... I know that I'm partially influenced by the opinions of other people on this card, because I know that someone actually values this as, like, super high. I think I'm going to keep this as A tier. Oops, that goes at the beginning. Yeah, that's where I'm going to put it. Okay. Up next is... Oh, this doesn't even belong here. This belongs at the end. I'm doing gems last here. Okay. Up next is Future Plans. Another card that I was sort of influenced to put at S tier, but I think that it... But I still have to think about this a little bit. Like, being able to put any card from your hand into stasis is very, very powerful. It solves any problem you have with your shield charger, or your orb walk, or any card that you want to put into stasis. It also, it seems very similar to Suspension, but the thing is that Suspension costs a card draw as well. So now you have an extra card to work with that you can put into stasis. It's extremely versatile. I think you can also put a card that just came out of stasis back into stasis in case you want to retain it, and it will go into stasis for one turn instead of its full value, because it costs 0 at the time. I think the only real problem is that, well, the problems here are that you run into space problems with your stasis slots. It takes up all of your stasis slots by itself. So that usually means you can't take any more stasis, or if you already have other things that do stasis, you don't really want to take Future Plans. So then you're relying on one card for all of your stasis stuff, which also leads to certain to draw order issues. Fortunately, it upgrades to be innate, so you can fix that. That being said, it is slow as well. Usually if you have an innate card, you don't want it to be as slow as it is. Cards that go in don't come out for a couple turns. The power that it provides is a lot. Upgrading it to be innate is difficult. I think using it is also has some downsides. So I think this is going to be an A tier. I originally had it in S. I'm going to keep it at A. I know that other people have also put this as their highest rank. I think that it's not deserving of that high. Alright, up next is Guardian Whirl. I have this in D tier because of the block requirement. I'm not 100% sure if that's correct or if it goes in C tier. I've used it late game in Act 3. I've taken it in Act 3 to use against Reptimancer. That being said, no, you know what? This does belong in D. The reason is because that block requirement is so hefty. You cannot take it early game unless you don't boss swap, and even then it's kind of iffy whether or not you can do it. Whether or not you can actually use it. I forget how much it costs. Does it cost 1 or 2? I think it costs 1. Either way, it's still only situationally useful. It's a dead card in any fight that you don't want the AoE. Like, 16 damage is not incredible. It scales with strength, but it's still very difficult to use well. Uh, if you like the fact that it also costs a card draw makes the consistency even worse. Because if you got 5 cards to get 20 block, that might not be too bad. Use 4 cards to get 20 block, now you got a problem. I think this is still situationally useful. Like, I don't think any of these are unusable, right? Clone is still good sometimes. Incinerate's still good sometimes. Emerald's still good sometimes. Guardian Whirl's still good sometimes. So, not terrible. I just think it requires too much of you. Harden, F tier. Its requirement is the same, 20 block. Its benefit is brace 10, gain 2 thorns. It gives you next to nothing the turn you play it. Unless it's putting you in defensive, which would require you to not be in defensive to gain the 20 block already. And it gives you 2 thorns, which is really low. It's such a small benefit. The only reason I could think to take it is if you absolutely need to stay in defensive at all costs and you're desperate. The only other time I've seen it be useful is in Compile package, where it doesn't stay in your deck. It would be with the Spheric Guardian package, where you get a Spheric Shield to give you that 20 block up front. And that's upgraded, by the way. When this is upgraded, it gives you 14 brace, which is cool. Actually, that is the most brace in the game, not those other ones. I just don't count this because you can't play it. So yeah, sometimes you get a little bit extra passive thorns from the package. Sometimes you get a little bit of extra brace. I haven't seen that be too useful yet. I think I've done it. I think I used that particular thing once with a. Yeah, I used it with a Liquid Memories to play it twice. Turns out that was a bad play too. I realized that I could just use HP to get back into defensive, or either that or the defensive was on the wrong turn, and I shouldn't have used the potion on that. Yeah, either way, trash card. It belongs down there with Crystal Ray. Alright, up next, Multi-Beam. Another card that I saw, this is a card that I saw was actually ranked kind of low on some people's, rankings. This is a card that I value very highly. This goes in B tier. It's AoE. It's easy to use AoE. The real only cost that it requires of you is an upgrade. 7 damage AoE is the upgrade. It's not so impressive. There's a couple factors that make it really good for me, though, in my opinion. One is that you can get energy very easily on Guardian when you boss swap. Not only do you have I've talked about this a bit already, but not only do you have a chance of getting that 4th energy from the boss swap, you will also be 1 further into your boss relic pool and get a better chance of getting an energy boss relic in your boss relic chests. So you can play that for 4 energy sometimes even 5, and it's a decent AoE choice if you're in need of it. And AoE is another thing that I've learned a lot about recently in my STS career. AoE solves a lot of difficult fights if you have enough of it. Act 1 especially. Slime Gang and Gremlin Gang both hit very hard, but also die to AoE very fast. So having this is, if I get offered that in Act 1, I will value it very highly. It's almost an imperative. It also helps against sentries, which almost requires a special card to beat them anyways. So, yeah, overall very nice card. And on top of that, there have been multiple times where I haven't even tried to make this happen, but it has turned into a damage engine with stasis. If I'm able to put this card into stasis for any reason, whether because I need to or because I just can't afford the energy to play it, which is sometimes a thing, I can put it into stasis and it will increase the damage. This is another reason why it absolutely needs an upgrade. Right now it's only 5 damage to all enemies X times and increases the damage by 1 when in stasis. By the way, X cost cards go into stasis for 1 turn, just like a 0 cost. And it upgrades to 7 damage to all enemies X times and increases the damage by 2 in stasis. I don't know why they have the number so low on the base card. It requires an upgrade. This is probably the only reason it's in B tier and not A tier, by the way. Otherwise, it's a very strong card. And the fact that it saved my butt multiple times, I value it very highly. I just wish that it didn't require an upgrade. That being said, uh, it hasn't been too bad. It's just felt bad to upgrade. Uh, because even after the upgrade, the base damage is still lower than Whirlwind, and Ironclad has strength too. So I would like to see like a little number buff to it somehow. I'm not sure exactly how. It would be nice though. Anyways, on to the next one. Orb support. Innate, deal 8 damage, put a random card from your draw pile into stasis. F tier. Silent has a card, Backstab, and she's able to use it very well. Why? Her starting relic. Draws 2 extra cards on turn 1. Having a card used on offense on turn 1 is not a big deal for her, because she has the extra draw. However, on Guardian, Guardian does not have that benefit, and a lot of enemies hit very hard on turn 1. You can't really, there's a lot of times where you can't really justify taking a card that doesn't block for you, that's guaranteed to be on turn 1. Also, the additional benefit of putting a card into stasis is like drawing a card and then getting it a few turns later instead of now. It doesn't actually speed you up. Like, you would think that because it takes a card out of your draw pile, it's speeding you up by 1 card, but it's not, because you're putting another card into your deck when you take it. So you basically go neutral. You go negative on turn 1 in order to get a somewhat positive later turn. And you can't control what you get, and you can't control what turn you get it. I think those are so many downsides that I like almost never take this card. It would have to be very extenuating circumstances for me to take it. I would need to have like a ton of draw on turn 1. Without Snekawai, by the way, it costs 0. Yeah. Dealing damage is not a great thing to put on an innate card, unless you're silent. Or unless you have the exact relics to deal with that. The Hermit used to have... The Hermit's quick draw card used to be innate, deal damage, and weaken. I used to undervalue that. I think if it was still that, I would take it more. I think it was a mistake to skip. But then again, like, innate weaken is kind of broken, too. Like, I think it was a common card even, which was even weirder. It's like you could stack it very easily. I don't know. I don't know how to evaluate Hermit cards very well. Alright, up next, Orb Walk. Orb Walk is another C tier card. Reason being is that it needs a lot of support for it to be good. On 4 energy, it's passable to just take by itself. The 2 strength is something I value very highly. On Ironclad, I found the power of Inflame during one run where I was sort of forced to take it early. I wasn't very impressed with it as a card before then, and then it just did so much damage in Act 1 that I was like, whoa, where did this come from? It might fall off later in the game. It's kind of hard to say that though, because, strength affects cards for the rest of the fight, so it's a scaling card. Maybe because Ironclad has some better ways to scale. It's not valued very highly by other people. I like it a lot though. That's part of the reason why I like this. 2 energy cost kind of hurts. I definitely like it a lot more when I can put it into stasis, but as a power, it's very hard to do so. Like I said earlier, you can't use reroute. You can't use reroute to put it into stasis. You have to use like either suspension or future plans, or you have to get lucky with your planning. And even then, you're only getting 1 more strength than if you just played the card yourself. I guess for 0 energy, that's fine. I guess for 0 energy, waiting for that strength is not a bad thing. I think it does feel underwhelming though. I take it only when I absolutely need to. The upgrade makes it not volatile, which means that if you do successfully get into stasis, you get 5 strength. But that being said, you can't just play the card for additional benefit. You actually have to put it into stasis for the volatile remove to actually be useful. So I think this belongs in C. It feels a little bit underpowered, Kind of feels bad as a card, honestly. Uh, I just know it helps sometimes. I hope that card gets a buff or in some way or a change. Maybe the upgrade gives you more upfront strength. That'd be cool. I would feel less bad about taking it. Alright, up next is Overload. This is going to be another controversial opinion. I'm putting it in D because it needs an upgrade. I am not of the opinion that draw 2 less cards is good enough on its own. I'm somewhat willing to take draw 1 less card next turn with the upgrade one because it reduces debuffs by 1. But here's the thing, right? Nerfing your future turns can sometimes be okay with stasis or with defensive. Sometimes it's fine. But a lot of the times you're going to be using Overload when you aren't powerful yet, when you need to get a bunch of stuff into play rather than already being set up. Drawing 4 cards also, like, that's a very late game thing to be taking. Drawing 4 cards, if you draw all of your good cards at once in the early game, or even in the mid game, you're probably not going to have the energy to play all of them. So then you're forced to make a decision between your good cards, and then on your next turn you have a nerfed hand of 3 or 4. I feel like this is very hard for me to take. Even if you're into temporary debuff scaling, it has so many downsides in the here and now that I don't like taking it unless I know I can afford to. So I value it at D. Up next is Polybeam. Polybeam is another C tier. This one's pretty straightforward. It's a 2 damage 4 times to random enemies. While that's cool and all, it has downsides just like Sword Boomerang. You need strength for it to be good. It is 8 damage, and it's spread out. Like, it's 8 damage for 1 energy. It's not very great on its own. It's spread out, so multi-enemy fights where you're already kind of weak, it's even worse. Like, I have taken this over Walker Claw in the late game, so it's definitely a late game card. It just doesn't feel strong enough on its own to justify being a higher rank. So yeah. Makes me wonder about these multi-attack cards. Like, they seem kind of similar to Ironclads. Polybeam is very similar to Sword Boomerang. Walker Claw is similar to Heavy Blade. Then you've also got this Refracted Beam that's, what is it close to? I don't remember. Maybe it's not close to anything. It has a different cost, though. I'll get to that in a minute. Alright, Pre-Program. Pre-Program is, I have it at B, but it might be A. You know what, I'm going to just keep it in B. I haven't really had much experience with this card. I often skip it. And I'm wondering if I should do that. I've been feeling how powerful it can be in recent runs. Being able to see the draw pile, and then putting a card of your choice into stasis for free, out of all those cards that you have not yet seen, is a really strong combo. I guess the 0 cost is what's getting in the way. Like, it doesn't do anything else. But maybe it should be as high as planning. Maybe, although a card of your choice versus 2 random cards. No, you know what? I've talked myself into it. It's going into A. And I'm going to be taking it more often from now. Because if you compare it to planning, you have more control over the cards, which I think is worth the 2 random. And you leave yourself room to take more stasis in the future. Which is something that planning can't do. It also has a socket, just like the other 0 costs. So I think between all of those, pre-program is very strong. Maybe it's hard to see why, from a viewer's standpoint, because, you know, evaluating the value of seeing your draw pile is kind of difficult. But it has felt very good to have that extra layer of control for the Guardian. Alright, up next is Prismatic Barrier and Prismatic Spray. Those are both D tier, and while I kind of like the concept of these cards, their downside is like terrible. They do nothing if you have no gems in them. Gain 2 block for each gem in this card, and deal 2 damage for each gem in this card. And you have 3 sockets. 3 sockets? Good. You can put anything you want into them. You can get really strong combos if you want, or you can just put a bunch of gems and get a bunch of random benefits. It leaves room to, you know, make something good out of them. The problem is that their opportunity cost is so high. And on top of their opportunity cost, because if you have no gems in them, they don't do anything. If you have any empty sockets, they do less. They also have the problem that you have to take gems to fill them, and gems are already opportunity cost. So you have to take several opportunity costs in order for them to be good, or you can spread it out over time and then wait for like Act 3 for them to be fully filled. Maybe if you're lucky, you get it earlier. But yeah, I think that these downsides override the fact that you get 3 sockets and you're triple scaling your defense or attack. They can be good sometimes. I had a Prismatic Spray in my recent run, and I even only filled 2 of those slots, and I was okay with it. But I think the downside is too small. I would like to see a change to these cards to make them feel a lot better to take. Alright, up next, Refracted Beam. This is another C tier. Now, this is a very similar card to Walker Claw. It deals 3 damage 4 times for 2 energy. You can see the resemblance. 5 damage 3 times for 2 energy, 3 damage 4 times for 2 energy. It's a little bit less base. Can be upgraded any number of times to hit any number of times. That's interesting. It's not meant to be played like Searing Blow, by the way. This is meant to be a supplementary damage card. You upgrade it a few times to use with your strength, and then you move on to other cards. I think that's fine as a gameplay pattern. I've used it before. It's been effective. Having something that hits 7 times is kind of cool. The cost of the multiple upgrades as well as the low base damage, I think, put it in the same tier as these other two. It doesn't feel good to take. I would really like to see it like upgrade. I would like to see it buffed to like 4 damage 4 times, since it's an uncommon. I think that would be a fair way to buff that. Make it 16 damage at base. Because if you want this payoff of like a 7 or 8 or 9 times attack card, you need to spend multiple campfires upgrading them. So I think it should have that benefit, because it doesn't scale like Searing Blow does. You shouldn't compare it to Searing Blow in that regard. You should just see what it does on its own. Okay. Up next, the very interesting card Repulsor. 2 cost, power. When you draw the first status or curse card each turn, exhaust it and draw a card. So Worse Evolve on multiple counts. It draws only 1 card on the first one that you draw. It costs 2. And yet, this is still an A tier card for me. Why? This is something that you have to know from experience, or, I guess listen to me telling you. What I've found is that Guardian really does not like curses or statuses. The way I play Guardian, and honestly even their card pool, they don't have very much card draw, or the card draw they do have is very hard to take. Most of the card draw cards only draw 1 anyways, which is not really card draw if you think about it, if you're looking for like getting cards faster, right? Like you have to add 1 card to your deck to draw 1 card. That evens out. So what you're ending up doing is you're relying on just whatever you draw for the turn. Another couple of things, of course, to keep in mind is stasis and gems, both making your deck very small. Smaller decks are more susceptible to curses and statuses, so having a way to get rid of them permanently is very good. In fact, the fact that you can get rid of them permanently is really good in the Neow fight, where getting rid of the curses is important, such as Bewildered or Flawed. Bewildered and Flawed have an energy cost attached to them if you want to prevent their downside. Repulsor gets rid of that. It does it for free. So yeah, Anytime I can afford to pick up one of these, I do. An additional reason is because you can fight Hermit as one of your bosses during the run, and if you do, the Niao's bonus from the Hermit will be when I buff, you get 2 extra curses thrown into your draw pile. By the way. I'm putting extra emphasis on that. Your draw pile gets smaller. Your discard pile does not. Your draw pile, because it gets smaller, you're going to have a higher concentration of curses if they get shuffled in there. Repulsor can help so much with that. Even in just the original Niao fight, you get 4 curses at the start of the fight. You get 4 curses at the start of the Act 4 Elite, too. And then Niao's single attack also puts a curse into your draw pile on her turn. So yeah, a lot of curses coming your way, even without Hermit. I always take a Repulsor if I can afford it, and often a lot of the times I can. Even with the 2 energy cost, I think the 2 energy cost is actually kind of fair, because it makes me think a little bit about whether or not I want to play it in a fight, or if I can play it. Upgrading to 1 cost is also effective, because I want that card to be in play in those late game fights. So yeah, overall, I think 10 out of 10 card, being A tier. Despite it being A tier, I don't think it should be nerfed. Please don't. It's especially strange. I kind of skipped over this because I was excited to explain it, but Guardian doesn't have any synergies for statuses or curses in any way. This is the only thing that affects them. It's the only thing, like, nothing can generate them. So yeah, I think it's fine that this card exists. I would understand if it left, like if it got removed because it just doesn't felt like it belonged. But until then, I think it's fine as a card and definitely takeable. It's also a nice answer to Ironclad 1. It's a nice bonus. Unfortunately, that's the only boss that gives you statuses. Out of the 15 total ones. Actually, I guess defect 1 still counts, but you still lose the energy anyways from the void, so I don't really count that. So I guess 1.5 out of 15, 10%. Still good. It does still have benefits in, like, the Sabers fight, because that can sometimes be slow, even though you usually want to kill them fast. You usually end up killing the back guy first, then the front guy, and then you leave the middle guy with all the statuses. Sometimes you can change up, sometimes you can't. So having less dead draws is nice. There's also it's also Chosen, even though it's only dazes, it's still fine to get an extra card draw. So yeah, it has a lot of very powerful uses in the late game and isn't too terrible to take in mid game. Up next, Resilient Plate. This I am also going to rank with the other 8 brace card already up here in B tier. This is something I had to come around on. It doesn't seem like it does very much. Reduce each debuff by 2, brace 8, exhaust. It doesn't give damage, doesn't give block, doesn't scale by itself. You need support for it, at least in theory. However, debuffs are not just for your temporary buff cards. They are also for the various debuffs found throughout the game, and reducing them by 2 can actually be very useful. Even in the fights where you only get 1, such as like Chosen or Snecko, they have other debuffs. Chosen can weaken you for multiple turns, and Snecko can weaken and vulnerable for multiple turns. And if you get Resilient Plate and play it, you cleanse all those debuffs. At least one turn's worth. And by 1 turn's worth, I mean 1 turn of Snecko doing it or Chosen doing it. So that's very powerful. And other sources of debuffs can also have multiple stacks when they're not those very powerful ones. And of course, the Brace 8 really makes this card. Brace 8 is a really high number in order to be able to go back to defensive. In the episode Light Yet Effective Brace build, this was one of the 2 main cards, along with Curl Up, that I was playing repeatedly in order to gain more Brace. The other cards I could only play once were Revenge Protocol, which were giving me Brace every turn, and Spheric Shield. And it was very effective at what it did. It's a very surprisingly strong card, and I think I'm going to be taking it more often as a sort of utility card in the future. It stays at B because I don't think I'm going to use it too much for debuff for temp buff retaining. I don't think I'm going to be using it. I don't think I'll be taking too many of them because it's a setup card. You can only afford to take so many of those in one deck. So yeah, it stays at B. Very solid card. You know, matches with the roll attack. Embrace numbers. I think that's a fair place for it. Up next is Sentry Blast. Sentry Blast is an A tier card because it has weaken every other turn. If you can properly control it, and it's not too hard to, you can get weaken on very powerful attack turns of your enemies. I kind of touched on this before with weaken. Weaken is very powerful in Guardian. Maybe it's not obvious why, because you know when you think of Guardian, you often think of like 90 brace. Sorry, not 90 brace, 90 block, and that will like block anything, right? The thing is that Guardians, that's like Guardian's ceiling, right? Most often it'll be somewhere around 100 when it's very, very strong. But at its floor, you're still getting somewhere from like 10 to 20, maybe 25 block. And weaken essentially multiplies your block in a way because it reduces because it divides your enemy's incoming damage. Weaken is 25%, which means that the enemies are doing 3/4 of their normal damage. And the way the math works out is that 3/4 of their normal damage means 4/3 of your normal block. So you're essentially getting 33% more block every other turn. And that's a lot. It's a lot. Also, the part that it attacks with is not to be ignored. Sentry Blast dealing 5 damage for 0 energy. That also happens every other turn. Which means that if you have strength and you don't have a way to dump it, this can be a very effective way to deal damage and get some block at the same time. Very powerful early game card. Only downside really is the only downside really is that it's not too strong on its own. You do still need a little bit of support for it, and also it takes up a stasis slot, which can be a bad thing. So stays in A tier, not S tier. All right, up next, Shield Spikes. Going here for the same reason as Resilient Plate and Roll Attack. Its numbers aren't great, but it braces for 8. The Thorns in defensive mode mean like nothing. That's such a low number. Like, why aren't they permanent? Is it because Harden exists? Like, let's Shield Spikes is a great way to get block if you are in a pinch, if you need block. That being said, it's kind of like, it's not great beyond that. It does kind of fall off late game as well. The Brace 8 is what it ends up being useful for, but paying 2 energy can still be kind of a hefty cost. I would say you're maybe paying half an energy more than you would like to by that time. Alright, up next, Time Bomb. Time Bomb says, it's 2 energy, place this into stasis. When it leaves stasis, deal 22 damage to all enemies. I have this in C tier. I'm not 100% sure if this should be in C or D. It requires some support sometimes. It will stay in stasis for 3 turns, then after that it explodes. It's kind of like the bomb like that. It takes time. The main thing that it's good for, the main thing that makes it good is, of course, Accelerate, which there are several sources of. This would be another card that's actually really good with Emergency. Or, you know, even just one Accelerate source. 1 turn of Accelerate can be enough to make it a good card. Its 2 cost is probably its biggest gate. And of course, since it's AoE, that solves a problem that you often have in the game. It just has sort of a timing problem. It takes a while. There are ways. The fact that it's in C tier, I think, over D tier is because it can be easy to get it out faster. There are ways to do that, and of course, it solves a very important problem. So that's where it's going to stay, I think. That being said, it's very unreliable. If you need it, you need it. You can't really stop that from happening. You just need to be very careful. You can't get comfortable from having an AoE card if it goes off in 3 turns. If you've ever played with a bomb, you'd know that. Bomb should really go off in 2 turns and not 3. Make it a good card, especially a rare colorless cards. Like, colorless cards are so weird. All right, up next, Time Capacitor. Time Capacitor is where? Time Capacitor is in C. I think that's fair. Time Capacitor, like, it's not often that you get so much stasis stuff that you want extra stasis slots. Sometimes you do, but oftentimes you're going to be, well, at least I will be, counting how much stasis I already have in my deck, stasis support I mean, and then not going above 3 if I can avoid it, or like trying to get a little bit more consistency. That being said, if you're going for just raw value from your stasis slots, putting a bunch of random cards in that don't actually need to be in stasis, like avoiding stuff like Shield Charger, well, I guess not avoiding, but not taking too many. If you're putting like a bunch of strikes and defends in, or maybe just a couple of 2-cost cards like Shield Spikes, Roll Attack, just because you need to get some free value on later turns, Time Capacitor can be good for that. And you know, it can end up being a very powerful enabler for your damage and block. Like in the Stasis episode, the Stasis Bread and Butter Stasis build, I did have Time Capacitor. My build revolved around putting a bunch of cards into Stasis to make my deck small, and also to get a bunch of free value from my cards. So yeah, it can end up very strong. It's just not a very... It just has its own niche. It can also... You need to be very careful with it, because it can also just end up being useless if you have a bunch of cards like Shield Charger or Orb Walk. You put them into Stasis, and then suddenly you can't fill up your Orb slots after they're gone. Your Orb slots? Your Stasis slots after they're gone. So yeah, just got to be careful about that. Alright, on to the gems. Amber. Amber is B tier, and this one I think I'm actually comfortable with. Accelerate is very useful as a gem, being a 0-cost attachment to anything else. This is actually somewhat versatile, almost as versatile as the Aquamarine, I would say. Being able to be put in most cards, I think that's fair to say, because you can get value from the cards that come out of Stasis in a similar way that you can get block from Aquamarine. It's obviously not going to solve every problem you have at all times. Aquamarine solves a very prevalent problem of being able to block. Amber is a little bit inconsistent, both in whether or not something actually comes out of Stasis, and also what comes out. But it also has that sort of power where you can put a card into Stasis and then get it back out very fast. You can sometimes create single turn combos with this card, like I mentioned with Incinerate earlier. If you socket an Amber into an Incinerate, you get a 2 Accelerate card, which can get the majority of cards out of Stasis immediately. So, you know, having that ability is very nice. So I think that belongs in B tier. I adjusted these 3 earlier. This, I think, is correct. Up next is Amethyst. Amethyst is an A tier gem, in my opinion. It has a little bit of a caveat. It only reduces enemy strength by 2. So there are situations where it is really good and situations where it's mediocre. Aquamarine, for reference, blocks for 3. In fact, I will even say it blocks for 4 with the Dex gem. So what you're looking for here with Amethyst is you're looking at a card that can sometimes only block for 2 versus Aquamarine's 4. So the times where Amethyst is good is either A, when you're getting multi-attacked, or B, when there are multiple enemies in the fight that are all attacking, or multiple are attacking. So it can have a better effect on those kinds of turns. However, it also has an additional thing. So the best way to use this card is, in my opinion, is of course in cards that need block. But I think the best way to use it is either in Twin Slam or Bobble Burst, because they can multiply its effect. And the main reason is that when Amethyst is good, it's really good. So you want to make sure that you get putting it in a card that can multiply its benefit will make it Very, very effective on the turns where you want it to be. And on the turns where you don't really need it as much, it is a lot more passable. But being multiplied by 2 or 3 with either a 1-time or 2 times attack can make it passable as a defensive mechanism. So I like this card a lot. I put it in Twin Slam all the time. I don't think I've put it in Bobble Burst yet. Maybe I have once. It's a little weird, but I think it's worth doing sometimes. So I have that in A tier. I think it's a gem I take sometimes, just if I have an open it, if I open a socket for Twin Slam or Bobble Burst. Up next, Fragmented Gem. I'm actually going to save this for last. I know I already moved it back, but it's here. It's going to stay there. Garnet. Garnet is a B tier. I think I'm going to stick with this again. Garnet is 1 vulnerable to all enemies. And I discussed before how having multiple vulnerable turns means that you don't need to draw attack cards with the vulnerable card on the same turn. Garnet has that problem. You need to draw whatever you have Garnet. You need to draw an attack card with Garnet or whatever card you have Garnet socketed in on the same turn. And that's difficult. Even with Stasis. Like, Stasis is a great way to manipulate card draw, or just a great way to manipulate cards in general, but it's not always the most easily controllable. So even with 1 vulnerable, it's kind of difficult. That being said, it still can be good, especially in something like Twin Slam or in Bobble Burst. Those multiply its effect, and honestly, I think you get more than double the benefit from putting it in Twin Slam. Not only do you get the benefit immediately by playing the second Twin Slam, since it's an attack, so like if you have a Twin Slam plus, you'll get 7 damage on the first hit and then 10 on the next. That's cool. But you also draw more cards the next turn, of course. And you also have a higher chance of getting a card from Stasis that can do something. You can strip Artifact faster. Yeah, there's all sorts of benefits to putting it in Twin Slam or Bobble Burst. The only reason it's not A tier like Amethyst, even though it has similar uses, it's because it's damage related and not block related. Maybe I'll change my mind about this in the future. Maybe Amethyst could be brought down to a B tier. I think that this is okay for right now. Alright, up next is Quartz. And this is a little bit iffy, but I'm going to put it in S tier. The reason being is there's a couple reasons for this. One, it has very powerful gem combos, such as it has a very powerful gem combo with Citrine specifically, and also with itself. Cards, if you can afford a card with multiple quartz in it, that can end up being very good for you. Secondly, there are good cards to socket it in, such as the 0 costs especially. That's just as good, if not better, than socketing an Aquamarine in those cards because they become cantrips. So they are essentially free effects, and you don't have to worry about whatever you draw next. Thirdly, it is a 0 risk card, or a negligible risk card. Obviously, it being a skill and a card play, it has downsides in fights like Knob or Chosen, or Time Eater, I guess if you're fighting that, or Niao, because it heals. But, like, other than those very small niches, Quartz is extremely powerful, because you can put it into a really good card for it, and not have to worry about not having it unsocketed until then. Basically, if neither of the other cards in your card reward you want, or something you want, then you can just take this for free and not have to worry about it. There are a little bit of a downside sometimes, so like, if you have good cards in hand, then you don't really want to draw another card in case you get a better one. It's usually negligible for me, though. Oh, I forgot to mention that other good cards include some, because this has so many good cards to put it in, you can make infinites with it, such as with the 0 costs, or with Temporal Strike. I've made Temporal Strike infinite before, as I mentioned. So, yeah, it's just got so many uses attached to it, and no risk. It's takeable in almost any situation, just like Body Slam, at least when you need it, right? Like, Obviously, Body Slam had that caveat, but but Quartz, the worst thing that can happen is that you don't socket it. Also, little thing to mention is that if you put it into stasis, you're essentially getting a free card draw next turn, which can be very good. Another way to manipulate your cards with just a cantrip, so that's cool. Alright, up next are our next two gems. I will be talking about these in tandem. Sapphire and Fragmented Gem. These are the two worst gems, in my opinion. Sapphire is very much agreed upon in this regard. Fragmented Gem is not. So here's the deal. This is going in D tier. This is actually graduated a tier from what I thought it was before. So congratulations to Sapphire, and Fragmented Gem is going in F. Why? So first of all, Sapphire. It's a pretty useless gem. It braces for 3. And as we mentioned before, with 3 brace, that doesn't do barely anything. Taking you closer to defensive is underrated, I think, in most regards, especially with the 8 brace cards. Resilient Plate, not Spheric Shield, Resilient Plate, Shield Spikes, Roll Attack. All 3 of those having 8 brace. Don't underestimate that. But Sapphire and other cards that brace for 3 do not do enough to get you into defensive. So what you want to do when you're socketing cards is creating something strong with them. You either need to be setting up you either need to be setting up something with it, such as like maybe a 0-cost card with a ruby to set up strength, or you need to dump something out of it, like having a prismatic spray with wards in it, or just any gems. Maybe a prismatic barrier with aquamarine and tourmaline and that kind of stuff. That would be a dump, or a payoff card, I guess. Or you need to make a strong gem combo, such as Twin Slam with both Dex and Ward in it, or with energy and draw in it, yeah, you get the idea. Sapphire can't do any of that. It can't even guarantee that you get into defensive. It can only get you closer to it. So, the best use of this card, and I've used it multiple times now, is to get a card that already has brace closer to defensive. Gives it a higher chance of being the card that gets you into defensive. And that can actually have tangible benefits. The higher chance that a card has of getting you into defensive, the more useful it will be more often. And Sapphire can't do that on cards that don't have brace already. So I put this into Roll Attack sometimes. I've put this into, what do you call it? Where is it? It's, right, it's in C tier. Piercing Hide, I put in a Piercing Hide as extra 3 brace. And I've put it into Priming Shot before. But I really only take it if I'm forced to. Right? I don't take it because I want it. Emerald is above this in this tier. I think they still both belong here, just for different reasons. This is usable. This is hard to want. This is something I don't want, but is usable. This is hard to want and hard to use. So, yeah, those would be. So that's why this is here. Now, why is Fragmented Gem something that actually does damage in F tier? Because it's the opposite of Aquamarine. Most of these, when you add gems to a card, you want it to be able to do something important. And while doing damage is important, it's not really solving any problems for your card. Like, even Sapphire, making it easier for you to go into defensive with a card play, solves a problem. It gives you block when you need it. Fragmented Gem is not really going to give you damage when you need it, and that's the only thing it can do. Also, it's an uncommon, whilst Aquamarine is a common. This may change, by the way, but Fragmented Gem is an uncommon. It's taking up an uncommon slot to give you more damage in a card when you don't really need it. Like, making a multi-attack card. And by multi-attack I mean a ×2. Unless you have it in like Twin Slam for some reason. uh, is unnecessary because you already have several other ways to gain multi attacks. You've got Polybeam, Refracted Beam, Walker Claw, and Floating Orbs, and all of those do so much. Even to an extent, like these D tier cards, maybe Multi Beam, maybe even Twin Slam sometimes. But then again, this can go in Twin Slam as well. The big problem is, of course, that like since those exist, you don't really need this to because they do it better. I did just make a suggestion though, that it could be changed to give you an Orb Slam, and then someone suggested it could be called Pearl. If it became Orb Slam, I think it would go up maybe 2 tiers to C. And the reason for that would be because you would be adding 2 times attack to a card. And with Strength Gain, that makes it actually viable as a multi-attack card. I think that would be a positive change for it. I don't like the idea of just making it a 1 times attack. I think its greatest use right now is with Dead Branch, and that's it. I know some other people like this card though. I know they like adding damage to certain things, and you know what? Maybe I wouldn't complain if I like had to fill a socket and I hadn't already, and I'm actually like looking to fill them. Maybe I wouldn't complain, but even then I'd have to watch out for Silent being in the game, because then that's Thorns damage. So yeah, there's that. Okay, I need more water. I didn't realize how much talking this would take. I thought it would be the same as a normal episode, but I guess we're already past the 3-hour mark, and I'm constantly talking rather than talking in gameplay. So I'm losing so much water. Gosh. Alright. Now we're on to the rares. This will be fun. Ancient Construct. Whew. I know I'm not going to be liked for this one either, but I'm putting this in F tier. At the start of your turn, if you don't have artifact, gain 1 artifact. Costs 3. So, obviously it's a way to scale temporary buffs, such as Ruby, Emerald, and Tourmaline. This actually does solve the problem that Tourmaline usually has with keeping the temporary buffs. Usually, with debuff reduction, it's not enough because you're only keeping 1 or 2 at a time, and Thorns, you need a lot of Thorns for it to be powerful. Also, the Thorns has like a thing where it's better used if you can just time it for the right turn, rather than actually trying to permanently keep them. Permanently keeping them though works with Ancient Construct, because you don't have to time it. But if you keep the full value, then you don't have to time it as much. I guess the only time that would be different is on Twin Slam, when you can only get the benefit once. By the way, that's a downside of Ancient Construct. If you have a temporary buff in Twin Slam, you can only get one of them and not both. So like, if you have an Emerald in there, you can only get 2 permanent decks. So Ancient Construct definitely is good if you can use it. Like, scaling up your decks permanently with Emerald, if you have block cards, you can get 4 Dexterity very easily, and 4 Dexterity is a lot, especially on a character that can get wards. But even then, you still have your defense and a couple common cards that block. So it's very possible for that to get very strong. And then, of course, once you're set up, basically you can set yourself up in any order you choose. You can get yourself block, you can get yourself dexterity, you can get yourself strength, you can get yourself thorns in any order. And of course, since it's so from here, you have to ask yourself, how effective is this actually going to be? And in practice, when it's good, it's very good, but when it's bad, it's not great. It's like you're eating up a card draw, of course, and if you don't play the card, then it's going to do it again, and you haven't gotten any benefit from it being in your deck. And that happens a lot with 3-cost cards like Ancient Construct is. Additionally, the other use of artifact and debuff reduction in general is to stop actual debuffs. It's not just to keep your temporary ones, your temporary buffs. But Ancient Construct is too slow unless you upgrade it, which feels really bad. You also can't prevent turn 1 debuffs, or start of combat debuffs, which there are actually a couple of in the bosses. Silent 2 comes to mind, maybe even Silent 3. I don't remember 100%. I know that Silent 1 gives you poison. I think the Defect 1 also has like, I know someone has a Gremlin Visage. No, not Gremlin Visage. It has a Red Mask, which makes you weak on turn 1. And of course, if you don't have Ancient Construct upgraded, you have to wait even longer to get your artifact into play, which means that you can't stop the debuffs from incoming. Also, it only stops one debuff at a time. So if you're being multi-debuffed, you can't stop it. So yeah, like, it's too conditional for my taste. It costs too much. You need gems, which sometimes just don't happen. It can't stop actual debuffs. It's too much. I want to like it, but like I feel like a little bit of dopamine when I see it in the cardboard, or at least I feel neutrally towards it. Maybe I don't feel dopamine, but I don't feel bad about it. But maybe I should though, because when I think about it, I just can't see it being good in most cases. In my opinion, it's borderline unusable. I know that like other people do like to use it though, so very hard to say that for sure will be bad. All right. Up next is Bauble Burst. Bauble Burst is going in A tier. The reason being is that it's just a very strong card. It's not an S because it requires you to like find the gems and upgrade it in order for it to be actually fully useful. It pretty much requires a second upgrade so you can get the second the upgrade so you can get the second socket. But yeah, multiplying the gem 3 times, even though it's 2 cost, is still very worth it. Pretty much any gem except for Sapphire can work in it, even Fragmented Gem. I'm not going to say that that's bad in it. Like, making it a multi-attack card can be really good, especially if you have a Ruby in it. 6 Strength and 3 Shivs is really nice. Although maybe not what I would do with it personally. Like, when you have multiplied gems, you probably want to go for defense and not offense. Otherwise, you're doing like what? What does that do, by the way? It's 11 damage in the late game plus 6 strength, and I guess you have 7 strength and 3 wards. Sorry, 3 shivs. 7 and 4 is 11 times 3 is 33. So 44 damage card for 2 energy. It's not that impressive, but it's something. In a defensive deck, it could absolutely work. Anyways, yeah, if you just take a look at all the gems here, Quartz can even be good with it. Sometimes, like, 2 cost, draw 3 can be okay. Either if you have a lot of energy or if you have a way to put this into stasis. I've actually done this once, speculatively, just in case I got a Citrine. I didn't. This was still good, because I could put it into stasis. This plus Amethyst is good for the same reason that it's good with Twin Slam. This plus Wards, you get a Dex gem in there, you're good. 3 times Vulnerable, 3 times Accelerate, those are all great. The temp buffs can even be good whenever they're multiplied this much. Tourmaline especially if you get this on the right turn. So yeah, all sorts of good things here. Like I said, the only reason it's not an S is because you need the upgrade and you need the gems. Sometimes I get pretty picky with it. Maybe, like, I get picky with it because I really want a really strong gem from the uncommons, or even Citrine. Or, oh yeah, Onyx exists too. You could get 3 stacks of a permanent buff. Probably Strength or Dex would be the best. So yeah, those are pretty good too. Alright, up next, Compile Package. Compile Package is also an A tier. Compile Package is a little bit interesting. You get to choose one of 3 packages to gain, and those 3 are chosen from a pool of 7. Those 7 include a bunch of different things. The reason this is an A tier for me is because those packages actually solve different things by themselves, at least for a turn. So like you have, at least most of them do. Sometimes they provide scaling. So like for example, the Automaton package gives you Giga Beam and also Resilient Plate. So you can play Giga Beam for a lot of AoE damage, and if you have a lot of strength, then that's even better against like, you can even use it against like bosses or something, maybe even elites that don't have AoE involved. But yeah, that can solve AoE fights and do a lot of damage on its own. It also gives you a Resilient Plate to cleanse the stunned debuff from it, so it sort of solves its own problem at the same time. It enables its own power. It gives you Brace, which is nice for going closer to defensive, and it gives you a nice zero cost card to deal with the rest of the energy. So yeah, as well as giving you something to solve your immediate problem, it gives you a couple other extra benefits as well, which is really cool. It's most cards don't do that. They'll give you like one very specific thing, whether it be front load damage, front load blocker scaling, or some kind of utility. It doesn't give you a bunch of stuff all at once, so that's kind of cool. Spheric Guardian gives you Spheric Shield, which is basically impervious. Then it also gives you scaling damage with floating orbs. It's a bit slow, but it exists. And also, it also gives you a Harden, which I guess exists that turn, and then becomes a curse later. But I guess that's the cost of gaining a block card that saves you that turn. And then you got some other stuff. If you don't have a lot of energy, you can take the Sentry one, which is a little bit weaker, but gives you Weaken for multiple turns. Takes up your stasis slots, or you can exhaust them if they're already full. They also give you somewhat consistent damage. They all do a bunch of different stuff, like Donu and Dekas and Defects both scale you in different ways. So the thing is that all these packages are trying to solve something very specific and give you a little bit of extra benefit as a bonus. And they'll do them in different ways. This is an A tier, even though I didn't think, like, I used to think that this was weird because it costs so much energy. You don't get these cards out of Compile package for free. They are still their normal cost. So you have to take that into account. But that being said, since it solves these problems so well, yeah, I think the energy cost is warranted. The other real downside is, of course, the fact that you're not guaranteed to get exactly what you need at the time. So it won't save you in every fight. The reason that this is an A tier is because it can save you in most fights, or it can do a lot. It can give you a lot of value in most fights. So even though it's not 100% consistent, when it doesn't low roll, it will. When it doesn't low roll, it will give you. It will save you enough HP to win a fight, and this is actually especially important in Act 2, which is great because you can get this after the Act 1 boss. It's one of those cards that's like insanely powerful in Act 1 as well, by the way, because of all the front load available in it. And going into Act 2, being able to solve these problems and saving HP in most fights, even if it's not all of them, it will be enough to get you through the act. And of course, it stays relevant in the late game with the scaling ones. Again, not consistent, but does it in enough fights to be relevant. So that's why that's there. Up next, Construction Form. Construction Form is my go-to S tier card. This, I know, has generated a lot of confusion and discussion around it specifically, because it looks like it's doing a couple things poorly at once. It is a buffer plus for 3 energy, so it's already a little bit worse than Defects buffer. And it says if you have buffer, gain 1 strength at the start of each turn. So it's a conditional weaker demon form as well. So how do you justify putting this at the top of S tier? The reason is that it's the reason comes from experience, my own experience anyway. I found that taking this card will save you if you need the HP, if you need the block rather, and if you don't, then you will probably need the strength. So like in hallway fights or elites, you will probably end up using the buffer, which is fine because it doesn't need an upgrade to get 2 buffer, and 2 buffer is a lot more consistent than 1. That's a pretty big benefit. So spending 3 energy on it is like getting a Wraith form, but maybe kind of better sometimes. Uh, that's maybe a bit of a stretch. It's comparable. It's a big block card, right? So anyway, 2 buffer. You get 2 buffer to block anything that's coming in, and especially in Act 2, those can be some pretty big hits. But even in Act 1 against elites can. And of course, the hits just get bigger in Act 3. So 2 buffer makes you consistently be able to block without needing the upgrade, unlike buffer does. And then if you don't use the buffer, which is in some elite fights and in bosses, you get to get strength over time, which is useful for killing those elites and bosses. Basically, it gives you exactly what you need. And the fact that it's not demon form means a couple of things. One, you don't need to invest a lot into defense in order to play it. On Ironclad, you need block cards or a block system in order to be able to play it safely because it doesn't give you block. This one does. And secondly, because you're building into that defense on Ironclad, Demon form, you're going to have a lot less attacks in your deck. So you're going to be like drawing through your deck looking for your heavy blade or your sword boomerang. It's going to take a while. You're going to get up to like 20 strength during a fight, maybe 16. Construction form, you don't have this problem because since you don't have to block as much with other cards, you don't need to take as many block cards. So that means you have a higher saturation of attack cards in your deck to make use of the lesser strength, and that is fine. You don't need 20 strength to win a fight. You need, like, if you're relying on strength, you need probably like 8. 8 strength is fine. Maybe on Guardian even 5 because Guardian is Guardian. You can afford to play slow and safe. So yeah, that's why that card is S tier. It's useful pretty much all the time. At least that's been my experience. If you're worried about taking that card, literally do not, and just take it. Just take it and try it out. See how good it works for you. Like even on 3 energy, it will save you a lot. All right, up next is Exploit Gems. I think this just has to go in either A or B by definition. I'm not too impressed with this card. Like, I feel like Bubble Burst is a lot cooler. It's a 0-cost cantrip. It draws a card, and you put 2 gems into it. Like you're just getting a couple of gem benefits for free, which is cool, but like not impressive to me. Maybe it's a lot better if you have temp buff scaling, because then you can put your temp buffs in there for free, and then get your other scaling cards, and you can just draw back around easily because it draws to replace itself. That being said, I think this has to go in B. Like, you can, like, obviously because it's a cantrip, you can take it and use it essentially for free, which is great, but whenever it's up against other rares, it feels so much weaker. So that's why this is in B. It's kind of interesting how a quartz, a gem, is S tier, and does the exact same thing as Exploit Gems, except in reverse. It's the gem instead of the socket. I guess probably because it's rare. If this was an uncommon, this would probably be in... Actually, it might even be an S, because uncommons show up pretty often. Or at least it has the ability to come up more often than Exploit Gems. I don't know if that's actually true. Maybe if Exploit Gems was uncommon, it'd just go in A. Alright, Fierce Bash. This is a D. D tier card. It needs so much support to be good. It's 3 energy for 18 damage up front. So you don't even have good front load on it. 3 energy for 18 is 6 for 1. Like, if you already thought 8 for 1 was low, this is even worse. And the fact that it's efficient is not great either. I definitely prefer 2-cost cards to 3-cost cards. They're in this sort of like perfect balance where you pay a little bit more for the benefit, which is understandable, but you still have energy left to do other stuff in your hand. Fierce Bash, and also like Bludgeon on Ironclad have a similar problem in that they take up too much energy for anything else to be useful during your turn, and if you need to block, then you're kind of in trouble. Fierce Bash, of course, is a lot worse damage. Also, the fact that it goes into stasis for 4 turns in order to scale up is kind of a bad thing. So not only does it not have the front load for 3 energy, but you also need stasis support in the form of accelerate most of the time. I'll say most of the time. I used to think it was all the time, but I think my recent run with Fierce Bash disproves that a bit. I don't think I had that much accelerate. I had 1 emergency, which was cool. Maybe that's enough, and with to be like a supporting damage source. But yeah, it doesn't feel like something I would want unless I already had the support for it. I don't think accelerate is abundant enough to justify it. Okay, up next, Gem Cannon, also S tier. I haven't taken that many gems in this series so far, but I feel like I've taken them a lot more before the series. I feel like I've taken a lot more socket cards and taken gems for them, or even just taken gems as a what do you call it? As a speculation, and then kept them unsocketed for a few floors, and then Gem Cannon just comes in and does so much damage. Like, 2 cost, exhaust all gems, including the ones socketed, and does 10 damage to a random enemy for each. It does so much damage in Act 2, and even in Act 3 to a certain extent. You can one-shot anything in Act 2 if you have a few extra gems. Like, especially if you have Vulnerable of some kind with Garnet or Vent Steam, which is a common. It does 15 damage per attack. Strength, it also scales with strength. The downside of just exhausting your gems sometimes just doesn't even matter. Especially in Act 2, you just want to get out of the fight, so kill him. Kill him and leave. And then, like, the fact that it's a curse in the late game just doesn't matter. If you're really feeling spicy, you can even just remove it. But really, the fact that it's a curse, like, your main problem is getting through Act 1 and Act 2. And if you can do that, you win. Most of the time. Guardian is kind of like silent in that regard. You get a lot stronger in the late game than the early game. Maybe it's not guaranteed. But yeah, this is just as soon as you take this card and start one-shotting Act 2 enemies with it, you'll know why this is S tier. Okay, up next, Gem Finder. Gem Finder could go in D, but I'm putting it in C. Simply because if you have a lot of empty slots, it's very good. It gives you if you play that card, then at the end of combat, you can choose a common gem to add to your deck. Out of three, you get a choice of 3 out of the 4 common gems in the game. And this is really good, like I said, if you have a bunch of open gem slots, because the common gems in particular are great for enabling certain combos. For example, if you're looking for defense, you can take a couple of dexterity gems and a bunch of wards, and then that will give you a block system. I did this once. I didn't know what the heck I was doing with Gem Finder before I did it, and then it saved me and literally gave me a block system, which was really cool. Also, if you're looking for rubies for certain things, like the Vent Steam in your deck, or your 0 costs, if you don't really need any more block, you can put some rubies in. If you're low on attacks, you can take Tourmalines. I've done all of these things. It can be good. It needs support. In fact, even one of the earlier episodes, I thought I was going to be able to use it, and then I just got a bunch of normal gems and then didn't take any more sockets. So, yeah, that was kind of a harsh lesson. I felt really bad about taking that Gem Finder in that episode. But I still think it's good enough to be here in C and not in D. I think with gem changes coming later, I hope that this gets buffed, though. I think it would be really cool if it gave you just one common, sorry, not one common gem, but one gem from any rarity every fight, instead of a choice of 3 commons. You just get one, or you can skip it. I think that would add so much more variety and be a lot more in line with its theme as a gem finder, or at least what people would like to have as a gem finder in terms of fun. That being said, I don't know if this card has ever been I don't know if this card has ever been rebalanced. Maybe it used to do that, and I just don't know. Just didn't know. So if that's the case, I'll be a little sad, but I don't think it'll stay like this forever. So that's cool. All right, Giga Beam. Giga Beam, A tier, easy. Uh, so downside of this card is that you're stunned next turn, which means you completely skip it. A lot of people see this, including myself when I first started, and think that that downside is scary. Surprisingly, it's not, for several reasons. One is that as a 3-cost, it is a 3-cost 36 to all enemies, and scales with strength multiple times. Even though the multi-scaling of strength seems weird, it actually makes it so that if you have just a couple points of strength, it can enable you to completely one-shot a certain list of enemies. Mostly ones in Act 2. Also ones in Act 1, of course. It drops off a bit in Act 3. You can use it in the Act 4 elite fight. But yeah, this card is actually really good most of the game. So if you have some strength, you can kill enemies before you have to worry about your next turn. Especially if you upgrade it. The upgrade is so important, I found. Like, for some reason, the numbers are, like, just barely off killing enemies and whenever it's unupgraded. So upgrading it right after Act 2, right after Act 1 is really important for getting, like, slavers. Or triple cultists or stuff. Otherwise, you're going to be too low to finish off the rest with normal attacks if you have time, and then you're stunned next turn. Secondly, the stun next turn is not always a bad thing, or not always bad enough to care about. Guardian has defensive mode, which means that if you keep block for next turn, you don't have to worry about it. Also, Guardian, also enemies just sometimes don't attack the turn after you play it. And if you know the enemy patterns well enough, you just don't have to worry about them. So yeah, that's pretty important. This card is definitely another one of those cards like Construction Form where if you need the AoE, you just take it. Just take it and try it out. Work around the downside as best you can. Debuff Reduction also gets rid of that downside, like I mentioned before. So Onyx, Resilient Plate, Ancient Power Plus, if you play it second, and Overload Plus can all fix that. It's a little bit wonky, but I guess that's the price you pay for such a strong card. All right, up next, Laser Turret, B tier. Consistent damage. It's 5 per turn, but you don't have to pay anything for it. Scales with strength and vulnerable, I think. And it stays in stasis for a while. When it comes out, you can just play it again for 0 and it goes back in. So yeah, consistent damage. Decent card. I think if you need the damage, you can absolutely take it. Easy peasy. Alright, our 4th protocol, we finally got to it. B tier. Simply because it gives you 5 brace instead of 3. This is massive. Maybe not massive, but a lot better. 5 brace is really important, because of curl up especially, but also just because it's very efficient. After 2 turns of Revenge Protocol, you can play curl up and go into defensive. So yeah, I mentioned that earlier. Also, I mentioned that if you don't get the draw exactly right, you can go into defensive a second time pretty easily. And of course, since none of these protocols upgrade to give you more brace, having 5 is perfectly fine. The only thing that this is really good for is scaling block, especially in the late game, Act 3, Act 4, Act 2 boss, I guess, sometimes. So yeah, that's really what you want to be taking that for. Anything else will slow you down. It won't even put you into defensive next turn unless you're lucky. So yeah, definitely a longer term scaling than an upfront benefit. Alright, up next is Speed Boost, which is going into C tier with Emergency. I find this really weird that it's like this. It accelerates 3 times, which means that it's not gated to just the first card in your stasis, but it's also behind a 1-cost payment, which is very weird to me. Like, the card evokes an image of being fast, of course, so that kind of So that kind of makes it, so that's kind of weird to me. Uh, Accelerate 3 times usually gets you 1 card out of stasis as well. I know that sounds weird because like most of them are like 1 cost, but usually you want speed boost to create some kind of combo, and combos usually come in the form of specific cards, and especially ones that are expensive. So sometimes you can get 2 cards out, but those cards will be a lot less appealing. They'll be a lot weaker. Um, Also, sometimes you deal with the same problem as like Shield Charger. You don't want to play it because you'll waste all the block on future turns. Like, I feel like this and Emergency are almost on the same power. The only reason this is slightly stronger is because Emergency exhausts. Like, otherwise, I think they're like exactly the same power, just different uses. I feel like this should absolutely cost 0. It feels bad at 1 cost. All right, up next is Spheric Shield, which is going into A tier. Only reason it's not an S tier is because of the because it makes it harder to go back into defensive after using the brace. Like on Ironclad, you can just grab an Impervious and be perfectly fine with it. It's just upfront block, and that's great. And you can make the argument that Spheric Shield makes up for that by putting you in defensive, which gives you the blur, keeps your block for the next turn. But Guardian can already do that with defensive anyway. So I don't really see the extra appeal in this. I think the fact that it makes it harder to go into defensive on future turns is a downside. There are several fights in which I will actually avoid playing this 2-cost big block card simply because it makes it harder to go into defensive later when I'm going to need it. When I'm going to need the extra block. So yeah, that goes in A tier though. Like, it's a good, like, if you're lacking defense, you just take that card anyway. It's not going to stop me from taking it. Alright, Stasis Engine. This is C tier. I really like this card, but I'm feeling more recently the 2-cost associated with it. The fact that it only does it once per turn, I feel like the 2 cost is a little bit too high for it. Like, I would definitely like a 1 cost. I can sort of see where it's coming from by being 2 cost, but yeah, it's a rare, right? Maybe it's fine as is. I don't want to complain about something if it's actually perfectly fine. It's just my own personal gripes, you know. Stasis Engine, whenever you play the 3rd 0-cost card in a single turn, gain an energy and draw a card. Guardian has a lot of ways to get 0 costs. This can actually be a way that Fragmented Gem is good. Aquamarine is similarly another gem that gives a card that costs 0. I had a run once where I kept a bunch of unsocketed gem cards to make Stasis Engine work. And it worked. It was good. There's also Stasis, which is why it's called Stasis Engine. It gives you 0-cost cards from that. Floating Orbs is a huge enabler for this because you get 0-cost cards every single turn. Similarly with Sentry Blast being 1/3 of that. So if you see a way to consistently get 0-cost cards in a single turn, Stasis Engine can be a great way to save you. Like, it saved me a lot when I've had a bad turn. If I can find a way to play 3 0-cost cards, suddenly I get another card draw, and that's another opportunity to save me. But otherwise, it's just another power boost. So I think it's a good card. It's only in C because of the combined 2-cost of the card itself, and also how much support it needs in order to actually get the benefit. The benefit's good. I don't think this deserves to be in B tier with what it's asking. All right, up next, Stasis Field, another A tier. This is like a block system in a card, or at least block support in a card. It gives you block every other turn. The card is 1 cost and says gain 7 block, place this into stasis. When it leaves stasis, gain 7 block. And of course, when it leaves stasis, it costs 0. You can put it back into stasis for another 7 block. So you're gaining 7 block the turn you play it, and then every time it comes out of stasis and you put it back, you get another 14 block. So on its own, you're gaining 14 block every other turn. If you have Accelerate, you win the game. No, you just have enough block most of the time. You might run out of fuel eventually, but usually it's very good, a very, very good defensive card. It's like, even though it's a block system, it's sort of a block system. It doesn't go above Spheric Shield because it doesn't have the front load that Spheric Shield does. And front load is very important on its own. Stasis Strike. I think this is B tier. Yeah, this is B tier. So 9 damage. It's kind of like a damage common, but gaining 1 stasis slot is pretty big. I don't know if it. I kind of understand why it's a rare, but it also seems a little bit undertuned. The real thing it enables is just being able to put more things into stasis over time. It's got the same strength as it's got the same type of strength as time capacitor, which is somewhere. It's down here. The real downside is only that like it takes longer to get those stasis slots. So if you have a lot of ways to put things into stasis, you can end up waiting a bit longer than you'd like to. But then again, like it being an attack means it also scales with strength. It being replayable means it has a higher ceiling. I think, like if I was offered both of these cards on floor 1, I would take I would take Stasis Strike. I think in a lot of other cases I would take Time Capacitor over Stasis Strike just because I need the burst rather than a card that stays in my deck and gives me more stasis slots over time. But yeah, both sort of have their own abilities. I think this is slightly better. You know, being a 1-cost attack deal 9 is a pretty nice upside to me. I think to belong in B tier specifically. You know, that's kind of where I rank decent common attacks, which this is. It being a rare, I don't think really hurts that much since it has that secondary ability. Alright, on to Time Sifter. Time Sifter, I'm sorry, even when you're good, you're bad. I've said that in a previous episode. You're in D tier. The fact that this only accelerates your front card is actually kind of slow. As much as like the word accelerate evokes a sense of speed, it is slow. It can be good in times where your stasis slots feel kind of clogged, and you might need to get a card out faster than usual. It is useful in those cases. However, it is a 1-cost power. It takes up a rare slot. It upgrades to be an 8, which is cool, but like it doesn't feel strong as a rare. It feels very niche. It feels like sort of a last resort. I might almost prefer to take like other sources of accelerate. Like maybe if I was offered an amber and had an empty slot in Twin Slam, I would take that instead. Being able to control when something comes out is also a nice benefit that Time Sifter doesn't really have. What I'd really like this card to be is accelerate all cards in stasis. That would be cool. That would be a rare card I'd like. Devs, please. Alright. Anyways, up next is our Citrine. The rare gem. This has to go in. That should be high tier, right? Where do I have it? Yeah, there it is. Okay, A tier. This isn't quite S tier for me because you can't just take it as often as Quartz. Like, I know that sometimes comparing like that is not completely a great. Maybe comparing like that is not the greatest thing, but I do know that this has some downsides. Like, sometimes you just don't need energy. Sometimes what you need is something else, right? Also, like, the reason it's in A tier, though, is, like, even though it's not as takeable as Aquamarine or Quartz, it does solve a very common problem with energy. It can turn a lot of cards into very good cards. Twin Slam being a 0 damage, 14 energy, plus your other gems for free is great. I did that in a recent episode. And had just a 14 damage, 2 ward card, and that ended up being very useful for the pyramid that we had. I think that was 3 Citrines in 1 act episode, where we had the pyramid there as well. Maybe it was either that or unclogging the pyramid. It might have been unclogging the pyramid, episode 9. Either way, even in certain situations, if you need extra energy, if you're stuck on 3 energy after the act, you can just leave it unsocketed and use it to gain an energy on certain turns. So it sort of has that power that Quartz has sometimes. Even though you can't take it completely, leaving it unsocketed is an option, and that's why it's rare, I think. Also, it's got a nice color to it. I like it. I like the way that it looks. Onyx is up next. This is C tier. This is something that I thought was D tier before, but I think C tier is a lot more fitting. The fact, like, I used to think about temporary, like reducing debuffs as like, oh, you just reduce your temporary buffs and you permanently scale, and I can't do that very much, so this belongs in D. But that's not the case. Onyx can also reduce all debuffs, from enemies as well. Putting it in Twin Slam can also be pretty cool for that too, for the same reason that like Resilient Plate's good, right? You can reduce your debuffs by 2, and then suddenly you don't have to worry about being vulnerable or weak, sometimes frail. So that's cool. So yeah, that's why I think it belongs in C tier. It's kind of niche, but also powerful if you let it be. As long as you have a good socket for it, I think it's worth taking. Alright, now we got our starter cards. These belong in F tier. I think Defend belongs even lower than Strike because you're often leaning into defensive mode than you are using Dexterity. And there's a lot of sources of strength on Guardian, so the Strike can be better. Either way, that's a very small difference. All it does is make me think about whether I want to remove these more. Curl Up is C tier. D tier? C tier? Yeah, C tier. It makes you really weak in the first few floors. The fact that this is a card that does nothing for you on the turn that you play it in the first few floors of your act, the first few floors of your first act, I think I attribute that to why you lose so much HP to certain fights. I don't think it's even a problem of like not having bonus damage, like I mentioned earlier, like how Ironclad, Defect, and Watcher have bonus damage in their starting deck, and Silent and Guardian don't. I think it really is just a little bit of a problem with the starting deck, because you also have Ascender's Bane at Ascension 10, so now you have 2 cards that do nothing the turn you draw it. Curl Up is, of course, good in later situations. It gets a lot better later game when you're doing a lot more brace stuff, and it can give you some benefit from giving you Stasis. But random card into Stasis can also be a downside. I think overall, this needs support to be good, so it goes in C. Now 1 second here. Okay, and finally, Twin Slam. Twin Slam, the starter card, in S tier. Why? Because it's in your deck from floor 1 and can make some really strong combos from the get-go. You get yourself any gem that isn't strength, in my opinion again. You socket it, and then you build into it. You have the opportunity to multiply any other good gem in the game with it. You get started on a decent combo. There's a 2 in 4 chance that you can get started on this Emerald Aquamarine combo to give yourself a better than Dash Plus with 4 temporary Dexterity. You can give yourself Thorns and then get like a Garnet, Accelerate, Amethyst, any of that stuff. Gem combos, multiplying the gems, all of this stuff is super, super strong, and you can do it from floor 1. You can make a very strong combo very quickly that will be relevant the entire game. So yes, this belongs in S tier in my opinion as a starter card. That being said, I don't think that it's overpowered, or at least it's fun enough to justify its power. Since you're going to have it all game, it's not like you're going to have to deal with the consequences of finding it in some games than others. It's a constant, so you can balance around it. So yeah, that's what I think. I think I'm running out of time to record here. I think my maximum is 4 hours. For some reason, the recording software is very strange. But yeah, again, links are in the description. You can find the spreadsheet there that I showed you, except the public version. You can find this tier list maker, and you can find my personal tier list as an image down there. And of course, the Discord if you want to discuss. Leave a comment in the comment section as well. Hope to see you again.